Imagine tuning into a quiet solar live stream on an uneventful afternoon. The sun hangs at the center of the frame, serene and golden, a constant so familiar it almost feels eternal. For weeks, solar weather reports have read the same minimal activity, no flares, no disturbances, silence from the star that sustains us all. Then without warning, the stillness fractures. 3 dark shapes glide into view. They move with an elegance that feels rehearsed, deliberate. Each passes across the glowing disk with unwavering precision, and as each one does, the sun reacts not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. Massive eruptions explode outward waves of plasma blooming like cosmic thunderstorms. The timing is too exact to dismiss. 3 intrusions, 3 eruptions, the odds of coincidence collapse to near zero. This footage wasn't captured by a deep space probe or a classified telescope. It came from a simple feed data publicly available from the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory, better known as SOHO. For 3 decades, that satellite has monitored the sun continuously. It's the kind of source scientists trust implicitly, its readings treated as the official heartbeat of our star. But when a small community of amateur astronomers reviewed the raw imagery, they found something that didn't fit any known pattern. One of them, a hobbyist known online as Thiago Dobsonian Power, downloaded the sequence, enhanced the contrast and slowed it down. What he saw made even seasoned observers question their understanding of solar physics. Each object followed a perfect trajectory. No spin, no fragmentation, no random drift. They moved like a formation, tight, aligned, smooth. When Thiago posted his findings, the reaction was instantaneous. Independent skywatchers verified the same frame. The timestamps matched, the eruptions matched, and yet the institutions that should have cared most, NASA ESA, the agencies responsible for monitoring solar activity, issued no comment, not a word. In a world where every strange signal becomes a headline, the silence was deafening. People speculated that perhaps the images were corrupted, that digital noise had mimicked motion, but cross-checks across multiple data channels confirmed otherwise. The motion was real, the timing was real, and the eruptions were undeniable. The sun, which had been dormant for weeks, suddenly roared back to life, the very moment these unidentified objects appeared near its surface. Viewers who stumbled upon Thiago's post watched with fascination and dread. The footage wasn't cinematic, it was clinical. The cold eye of a scientific instrument recording something that shouldn't happen. The commentary sections filled with questions no one could answer. Were these asteroids, comet fragments, secret satellites, or something else entirely? As speculation spread, a quieter fear began to take hold, not of what was seen, but of what wasn't being said. No press conference, no emergency bulletin, only an empty feed and a growing sense that something extraordinary had just unfolded, and those who knew were choosing to say nothing. That silence became the real story. When powerful institutions go quiet, people notice. And when the universe itself seems to respond to something, invisible imagination fills the void. Could these objects have triggered the eruptions? Were they part of the same interstellar anomaly astronomers had recently labelled 3I Atlas, an object already breaking scientific expectations? No one could say for certain, but the alignment was too perfect to ignore. What began as a minor anomaly in a live stream now stood as one of the strangest coincidences in modern astronomy. 3 unidentified bodies appearing behind the sun, 3 violent solar flares erupting in their wake, and a global silence that he felt intentional. The event had no official name, but among the growing online community of skywatchers, it earned a nickname that captured its impossible symmetry: the Triple Echo. For those who saw the footage, disbelief soon gave way to curiosity, and curiosity to obsession. The deeper they looked, the more the event resisted explanation. The motion was smooth, the scale immense, and the timing surgical. Thiago's footage spread beyond astronomy forums into the public sphere, where it took on a life of its own. Memes, edits, re-uploads, each iteration, feeding the idea that something had happened behind the sun that humanity wasn't supposed to see. But behind the digital noise and speculation, one fact remained solid. The images were real, the eruptions were real, and no one in authority was talking. That's where our story begins, at the edge of silence, staring at 3 shadows, crossing the face of the sun, and asking the question the data itself refuses to answer. If coincidence is impossible, what's left? When Thiago first captured those frames, he assumed what any rational observer would, that his equipment had glitched. But this wasn't a backyard telescope feed. The data came straight from the LASCO C3 instrument aboard the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory, orbiting 1,000,000 miles from Earth at the L1 Lagrange point. For 30 years, SOHO has kept its watch uninterrupted, recording every flicker, every solar breeze, every eruption with a precision that leaves no room for myth. It is quite literally the sun's diary. And this time, that diary wrote something no scientist could easily explain. Thiago downloaded the publicly available data and compared it frame by frame. Each image is stamped in time, logged in NASA's servers, mirrored in ESA's archives, duplicated by independent researchers. There was no possibility of tampering. He watched as the first dark sphere entered the outer corona, gliding smoothly through the glowing haze. Seconds later, a flash, an eruption blooming outward from the precise region the object had passed. Then the second, then the third. Every timing interval matched, every trajectory ran parallel. To call it coincidence felt less like skepticism and more like denial. Within hours, astronomy forums lit up with discussion. Amateurs across continents pulled the same dataset and reached the same conclusion: this wasn't an imaging artifact. It wasn't cosmic rays or camera burn. The patterns were too consistent, the motion too deliberate. Some tried to argue that these were ordinary comets, debris from the endless traffic that drifts past the Sunday, but even those arguments unravelled quickly. No known comet moves in synchronized formation, none travel in perfect geometric spacing, and none have ever caused the sun to react with explosive timing. Still, official channels remained silent. The European Space Agency released no bulletin. NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory issued no updates. The data remained online but devoid of context, as if the agencies themselves had collectively decided not to acknowledge what they were seeing. In a digital world, addicted to explanation, that void was deafening. In the days that followed, a few professionals quietly broke ranks. A retired heliophysicist from Arizona commented on a private research board, writing simply, "If this is genuine LASCO data, then something unprecedented just happened." His post vanished hours later. Another researcher uploaded an annotated video overlaying magnetic field lines on the footage, demonstrating how the eruptions aligned with the passage vectors of the objects. That video disappeared within 24 hours. Every mirror link followed. Every re-upload flagged for data inaccuracy. The pattern was as unmistakable as it was disturbing. For Thiago and others who had stumbled onto this cosmic riddle, the question shifted from what happened to why no one was talking about it. In the absence of answers, speculation became the only available form of truth. Were the object's natural unknown phenomena fragments from interstellar space drawn toward the sun's gravity? Or were they engineered, operating with intention? The footage refused to declare allegiance to either theory. All it offered was motion too perfect to dismiss and silence too heavy to ignore. Night after night, Thiago combed through old LASCO archives searching for precedents. Decades of solar data scrolled by countless comets plunging into the corona, vanishing in brilliant vapor. None behaved like this, none moved in unison, none left behind the same violent chain reaction. Each frame of 3I Atlas and its companions told the same impossible story: 3 dark travelers crossing the sun's domain and leaving chaos in their wake. The astronomy community split in two. On one side, cautious voices demanded patience, urging verification before hysteria. On the other, those who had seen the unaltered data spoke of cover-ups of deliberate suppression. Every hour, the agencies remained silent. The theory of concealment grew louder. The sun had erupted in rhythm with intruders, and the watchers of the sky were pretending not to see. For the public, this silence became intoxicating. YouTube channels dissected every pixel. Reddit threads turned into round-the-clock investigations. Amateur scientists compared timestamps with solar radio bursts, noting faint disturbances that coincided precisely with each eruption. If the pattern held true, it wasn't just a solar coincidence. It was a dialogue between the unknown and the star that birthed us. What disturbed Thiago most wasn't the possibility of alien craft or secret satellites. It was the feeling that someone already knew. That these objects had been anticipated, expected even, and that their presence was not a discovery but a confirmation of something hidden for years. The archives, the erasures, the silence, it all pointed toward one chilling conclusion the watchers had been watched all along. The deeper Thiago dug, the stranger the patterns became. Beyond the three objects, subtle distortions rippled through nearby solar filaments, tiny rhythmic oscillations that hinted at magnetic interference. He sent his analysis to a small circle of independent astrophysicists. Most never replied. One did, briefly writing, "You're not wrong, you're just early." That message arrived with no signature, and it was the last communication Thiago received before his account was abruptly locked, his datasets inaccessible. Behind the sun, something had moved, and on Earth, something or someone had moved to make sure no one asked why. Numbers don't lie, at least not in the way people do. They carry no emotion, no instinct for drama. They simply measure what is, and when Thiago's footage was analysed mathematically, the numbers began to whisper something impossible. The chance that three unconnected objects could each trigger a solar eruption within moments of crossing the sun's face was statistically less than 1 in 10 billion. That figure wasn't an exaggeration pulled from internet lore. It was calculated by independent researchers comparing historical solar event timing with the passage of known comets. The result was chilling, no precedent, no known pattern, no explanation, grounded in probability. To put it plainly, the event shouldn't have happened. Not once. Certainly not 3 times in perfect succession. Solar eruptions are notoriously chaotic. They depend on magnetic field tensions, plasma flows, deep convective patterns that even the best simulations struggle to predict. It's like trying to forecast the flicker of a candle in a hurricane. For 3 eruptions to occur, not randomly, but precisely in sync with the transit of 3 objects, meant one of 2 things. Either we were witnessing the strangest coincidence in astrophysical history, or something had interfered deliberately, or not, with the sun's magnetic equilibrium. Across online observatories and amateur networks, debates raged. Some claimed the objects were fragments of 3I Atlas, the interstellar comet that had already stunned the scientific community with its speed and trajectory. Others argued they were artificial probes, perhaps positioned with surgical accuracy. The idea was heresy to mainstream astronomy, but even skeptics struggled to reconcile the alignment. The math refused to bend. One physicist described the odds in stark terms. It's like shuffling a deck and pulling the ace of spades 500 times in a row. Another said, if this is random, then so is gravity. The arguments quickly moved beyond data into psychology. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We see faces in clouds, constellations in chaos, meaning in noise. But even the most skeptical minds know that sometimes patterns are not illusions, they're evidence. The question became, which was this? The institutions tasked with answering such questions maintained an iron silence. No press release from NASA, no update from ESA, not even a quiet footnote in solar activity logs. The same agencies that announce every new exoplanet and celebrate every minor flare now acted as if the sun itself had gone off script without their permission. Their silence became an answer all its own. Meanwhile, Thiago's discovery spread beyond astronomy circles into public consciousness. Channels that usually discussed black holes or planetary formation began dissecting his frames. They highlighted how the 3 eruptions erupted from regions magnetically dormant minutes before the objects passed. Others noted how the plasma arcs bent in unexpected directions, almost as if responding to invisible commands. It wasn't just visual, it was behavioral. The sun had reacted. Within weeks, independent astrophysicists attempted to replicate Thiago's analysis. They gathered raw SOHO data, ran their own timing models and produced similar results. Each verification tightened the noose around coincidence. The probability collapsed further until random chance ceased to be a credible defense. But accepting that something external influenced the sun opened a far more frightening possibility of what kind of external factor could survive so close to the star. The corona reaches millions of degrees. Radiation would vaporize ordinary matter in seconds. Yet the objects maintained their shape, their trajectory, their impossible poise. That realization shifted the narrative from curiosity to alarm. If these weren't natural fragments, if they weren't illusions, then their resilience implied technology far beyond human capacity, materials or mechanisms that could endure proximity to a living star. And if they were technological, the implication wasn't just extraterrestrial, it was intentional. Thiago avoided that word at first. Intentional sounded reckless, like inviting madness into science. But as he mapped the trajectories, he noticed something that made his stomach turn. The three objects weren't just travelling past the sun. They were converging at precise intervals as though following a synchronized pattern. Their spacing wasn't arbitrary. It was geometric. He plotted their coordinates and found near-perfect symmetry, a triangular arrangement scaled across millions of kilometers, rotating slightly in alignment with the solar equator. The pattern suggested coordination, as if they were executing a maneuver, a message written not in words but in motion. Across the data, the silence of official science persisted. When one researcher attempted to publish a short analysis in a minor astronomy journal, her submission was quietly declined with the note, "Outside current research scope," but beneath that silence, unease was spreading. Whisper networks of scientists traded private emails, some confessing sleepless nights over the data. Others invoked history, the early 20th century reports of solar companions long dismissed as optical illusions. What if those weren't illusions at all, but precursors of what we were seeing now? Every discovery comes with a cost. The cost of believing too soon is embarrassment. The cost of believing too late is ignorance. And somewhere between those two fears, humanity stood frozen, staring at three dark shapes in the light of the sun, caught between statistical impossibility and institutional denial. If coincidence was dead, then something else had taken its place, something that moved with purpose, something that might be watching. Science prides itself on skepticism. It teaches caution, restraint, and the discipline to doubt even what the eyes can plainly see. But there is a line where skepticism ceases to protect truth and starts protecting comfort. That line is the dogma barrier, the invisible wall that separates open inquiry from institutional denial. And when the story of 3i Atlas reached that wall, the reaction was predictable and revealing. In forums and private channels, scientists debated the triple eruption with academic detachment. They discussed solar plasma dynamics, imaging calibration, and statistical anomalies, but few dared to utter the obvious question: what if the objects weren't random at all? To suggest intention, even hypothetically, was to risk professional exile. In modern academia, it is safer to be wrong within orthodoxy than right outside it. One name surfaced repeatedly in these conversations: physicist Sabine Hossenfelder. Known for her sharp criticisms of speculative cosmology, she became an unlikely symbol of cautious honesty. In a recent lecture, she had warned that ignoring anomalous data, simply because it contradicts expectations, is the most unscientific thing a scientist can do. She was not speaking about 3i Atlas specifically, but her warning applied perfectly. To reject evidence because it feels impossible is not reason, it's fear wearing the mask of logic. Still, the culture of silence persisted. When Thiago attempted to reach out to professional observatories for collaboration, his messages went unanswered. One contact at a research centre finally replied privately, "We saw the footage. We were told not to comment until review is complete. There was no indication who issued that instruction or when the review would end." Weeks passed. The review never came. Behind closed doors, a subtler war was unfolding. Senior researchers argued that speaking publicly about the anomaly could damage the credibility of the field. Grant committees quietly reminded younger scientists that controversy attracts scrutiny, and scrutiny endangers funding. The incentive structure of modern science did the rest. Ambition turned to silence. Curiosity turned to compliance. What happens when discovery itself becomes dangerous? When asking the wrong question costs a career, science ceases to be a method and becomes a performance, a play staged for institutional safety. The dogma barrier is built not from ignorance but from fear of losing control over the narrative of truth. Meanwhile, the data did not wait. As independent analysts kept parsing the Soho archives, they began to notice more irregularities, subtle brightening patterns around the solar equator. Microbursts of radiation synchronized with the object trajectories. These findings never appeared in peer-reviewed journals. Instead, they circulated in encrypted PDFs, and obscure astronomy boards passed like contraband among those who refused to stop asking. The irony was inescapable. The same civilization that celebrates discovery was now terrified of it. For every scientist willing to speculate, 10 others insisted on restraint. The phrase, "extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence," became a shield against discomfort, used not to demand rigour, but to justify inaction. It was repeated so often it lost meaning, becoming a mantra of deflection. Sabine's warning echoed louder. When you refuse to investigate what contradicts your theory, you are protecting yourself, not the truth. The more the institutions resisted, the more the anomaly demanded attention. The silence itself became suspicious evidence. Within this silence, the story took on new life outside academic walls. Documentary channels, podcasts, and late-night radio began calling it the solar event. Hosts debated whether the objects were fragments, probes, or something else entirely. Every absence of explanation became proof that something was being hidden. The narrative no longer belonged to scientists, it belonged to the public. And yet for those within the scientific community who watched from the sidelines, the emotional toll was immense. They had trained their entire lives to trust data, to chase anomalies, to seek the unknown. Now they were expected to look away. The dogma barrier had become a prison of reason, and its bars were forged from fear of ridicule. History offers grim precedent. When Galileo first described moons orbiting Jupiter, the academic elite refused even to look through his telescope. They declared the moons non-existent because their existence threatened doctrine. Centuries later, the same pattern repeats, not with planets or orbits, but with pixels and plasma. Humanity's instinct for denial remains constant, even when our instruments evolve. Tiago, now aware that his discovery had crossed from science into taboo, began archiving every piece of data offline. He understood the game had changed. Once curiosity becomes threat, truth becomes fragile. The dogma barrier, unseen yet absolute now, stood between humanity and the most profound question of the age. If something intelligent had touched our sun, would we even allow ourselves to know light has always been a faithful messenger? It travels for billions of years without tiring, carrying information about everything it touches: stars, dust, planets, even the invisible structures between them. For centuries, scientists have trusted it as truth incarnate. But sometimes, even light begins to lie. When researchers analysed the light reflected from 3i Atlas, they expected a familiar pattern. Every comet, from the dusty tails of Halley to the icy shards of Borrelly, scatters sunlight in predictable ways. That scattering, known as polarization, tells scientists what a comet is made: of ice, carbon, silicate, dust, the raw materials of the solar system. But the readings from 3i Atlas didn't match anything in the cosmic catalogue. The light behaved like it was being filtered through something engineered rather than natural. Ordinary comets polarize light weakly and positively, meaning the light waves oscillate mostly in random directions after scattering. Atlas, by contrast, showed negative polarization, an inversion so extreme that it defied every known model. At specific angles, the oscillations flipped, as though the object's surface were reorganizing the light, deliberately filtering it with uncanny precision. Scientists accustomed to dusty chaos now stared at data that looked structured, refined, controlled. The first paper to discuss this anomaly was cautiously titled "Unusual Polarimetric Signatures of Interstellar Object 3, I divided by Atlas." Buried deep within its charts was a line that made seasoned astronomers uneasy. Observed values reached beyond the established domain of natural dust-scattering behavior. In simpler terms, nature doesn't do this. Something about 3i Atlas breaks the rules. To understand how strange this is, imagine dropping a pebble into water and watching the ripples move only in straight lines, never curving, never fading. That's how alien the readings were. The light coming off this object wasn't random. It was disciplined, as though reflecting from surfaces arranged with purpose. Thiago, still haunted by the triple eruption footage, found himself drawn deeper into this new mystery. The data came not from amateur cameras but from professional observatories across multiple continents: Gemini, Subaru, VLT, all confirming the same impossibility. Each institution logged polarization curves that no natural comet could produce. And yet, after publishing the data, they too went silent. The papers appeared in minor journals devoid of press coverage, buried beneath less controversial discoveries. What made the phenomenon even stranger was its consistency. Other interstellar visitors, Oumuamua Borisov, had shown mild anomalies, but nothing like this. 3i Atlas wasn't merely odd, it was singular. Its light didn't just defy explanation, it mocked it. Some scientists speculated about exotic dust grains, larger than normal, packed tightly enough to behave like metallic crystals. Others proposed that Atlas was unusually dense, its gases trapped under pressure, its surface coated with reflective minerals never before catalogued. Those theories filled conferences, but they never quite fit. The patterns were too clean, too deliberate. A few dared to whisper a more radical thought. What if the polarization wasn't an accident of material but a function of design? What if the surface was engineered to interact with light in a specific way, perhaps as a signal, perhaps as camouflage? That idea, even spoken in confidence, was heresy. One researcher, writing under a pseudonym, posted a forum comment that read, "If this is a natural object, nature just learned how to program light." The comment vanished within hours. Yet in private discussions, more physicists admitted their confusion. Negative polarization that's strong doesn't arise by chance. It implies texture layering or geometry beyond random dust. It implies control. Thiago compared the polarization data to the timing of the solar eruptions from his footage. A pattern emerged. The peak polarization points aligned with the same dates the mysterious objects crossed the sun's path. In simple terms, the strange light signatures intensified during the exact window of the triple eruptions. The implication was staggering. Light, the most honest witness in the cosmos, seemed to be describing something alive, something that reacted, adapted, and possibly communicated through its own reflection. By the time the findings reached independent analysts online, the phrase polarization paradox had entered public vocabulary. It became shorthand for the unexplainable proof for some that Atlas was more than a comet, and for others that the universe had simply outsmarted human understanding again. But amid all the speculation, one truth remained unshakable. Whatever 3I Atlas was, its light carried a signature that did not belong to dust, ice, or randomness. It belonged to something that understood how to shape the fabric of illumination itself. The cosmos had always spoken in the language of light. Now, for the first time, that light seemed to be speaking back. If light is the storyteller of the cosmos, then chemistry is its confession. Every atom sings in a distinct tone, and when astronomers listen through spectroscopy, they can hear the universe reveal its secrets one wavelength at a time. For decades, this technique has told us what stars are made of, what comets carry in their frozen hearts, and how the early solar system once smelled of carbon and ice. But when scientists turned their spectrographs toward 3I Atlas, the universe began whispering something that made no chemical sense at all. The first observatory to report the anomaly was KEK in Hawaii. When its massive mirror caught the reflected sunlight from Atlas, the data seemed at first routine bright spectral bands of common elements like carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. But then the analysts noticed something buried within the noise, a sharp emission line belonging to nickel. Not strange by itself until they realized what was missing: the iron line. In every known comet, nickel and iron appear together, in almost perfect balance, forged side by side in the same stellar crucibles. Here nickel blazed alone. At first, the research team suspected calibration error. Instruments drift, filters degrade, sensors lie. They recalibrated, rechecked, and compared against control samples from other comets. The anomaly persisted. The ratio of nickel to iron in Atlas wasn't slightly skewed, it was catastrophic. Nickel dominated by orders of magnitude. The data violated the basic principles of cosmic chemistry. Within days, other observatories pointed their lenses at the object to confirm. Chile, Japan, Spain, Arizona all reported the same result. Nickel everywhere, iron almost nowhere. When cross-referenced with another measurement, the faint cyanide emission common in comets, the ratio became even stranger. Nickel outshone cyanide by a factor that defied every known formation model. It wasn't a cometary fingerprint, it was a chemical signature, more reminiscent of a refinery than a snowball. That comparison led to a deeply unsettling hypothesis. On Earth, the only natural process that produces such high nickel purity is industrial. Nickel separated from iron in this way is the product of smelting, purification, or deliberate processing, and there exists only one compound known to generate this imbalance with efficiency: nickel carbonyl, a substance so toxic and so specialized that it appears almost exclusively in human metallurgy. It forms only under specific controlled conditions: precise temperature, precise pressure, abundant carbon monoxide. It is the fingerprint of design. Of course, scientists aren't eager to declare a comet industrial. The professional response was cautious, even defensive. They invoked exotic chemistry instead of intelligence. Perhaps Atlas contained dense metallic grains buried under an unusually porous crust, or perhaps the nickel formed under extreme interstellar radiation, separating from iron through unknown thermal processes. The explanations grew complex, even desperate. None could fully account for the ratios. Avi Loeb, already infamous for asking unaskable questions about Oumuamua, quietly weighed in from Harvard. He assigned probabilities instead of opinions, 4 out of 10 for natural causes, 6 out of 10 for something non-natural. In scientific language, that was as close to a raised eyebrow as one could get. Loeb's comment rippled through the community. It didn't prove anything, but it gave legitimacy to the whisper that no one dared speak aloud. Meanwhile, independent analysts noticed another detail buried in the KEK data: the localized shifts in the nickel lines themselves, as if the metal were not distributed evenly but arranged in clusters or layers, stratified, structured. In manufacturing terms, it resembled plating. In geological terms, it resembled nothing. Thiago read these papers like dispatches from another reality. The same object that had triggered solar eruptions now appeared to carry the chemical hallmarks of metallurgy. He mapped the emission data against the solar event timeline and saw an eerie correspondence. The brightest nickel signatures coincided with the period of the triple flares. It was as if the object had responded to the sun by revealing more of its metallic skin. The story now had weight. Not myth, not speculation, but measurable, reproducible data. Still, the official response remained absent. No press conference, no televised explanation. Only whispers and PDFs, and the creeping realization that the line between natural and artificial might be thinner than we imagined. For the first time, some astronomers began using a word long banned from scientific vocabulary manufactured. Not because they believed 3I Atlas was a spaceship, but because nature to their knowledge doesn't forge such purity. The elements seemed too clean, too purposeful, as though refined somewhere beyond the reach of stellar evolution. And so a new paradox formed in the heart of science. Either 3I Atlas was a comet built by forces we didn't yet understand, or it was never a comet at all. Every discovery begins as an answer to a question no one thought to ask. When nickel replaced iron in the spectrum of 3I Atlas, the world's observatories were forced to consider a question that would have once ended a career. What if this isn't just an object? What if it's an engine? The suggestion wasn't metaphorical. In industrial science, nickel carbonyl isn't just a curiosity, it's a compound used to purify and shape metal. It's the beating heart of metallurgical refining, separating impurities through chemical precision. Seeing that same signature echoing from the frozen surface of a supposed comet was like finding exhaust residue in a glacier. The chemistry didn't describe a passive rock adrift through space. It described work process motion transformation. At first, researchers leaned toward exotic natural mechanisms. Perhaps the object had formed in a region of space rich in carbon monoxide. Perhaps radiation pressure had refined its surface across millions of years. These explanations were elegant, plausible, and soothing. But none explained why the ratios changed as the object drew nearer to the Sunday. Instead of burning off or dissolving, the nickel lines intensified. The closer it came, the more pronounced its signature became, as if heat and radiation activated something, rather than destroyed it. Thiago noticed this before anyone else. Plotting the data, he saw the curve rise exactly as solar activity spiked. It was as though 3I Atlas was feeding on the energy-absorbing radiation, converting it, responding. The chemistry didn't just shift passively, it behaved dynamically. If that observation were true, then the object wasn't simply reflecting sunlight. It was interacting with it, and that changed everything. In physics, energy transformation is the foundation of engines. To take radiation and turn it into something usable, motion-heat magnetism requires structure and intention. Natural comets sublimate ice into vapor. They lose energy as they near the Sunday. 3. Atlas seemed to do the opposite. Its emissions sharpened, its patterns intensified, its spectral noise decreased. It was becoming cleaner under stress, not more chaotic. One astrophysicist described it privately as a machine that polishes itself while falling into fire. Another said, the data looked too stable for randomness, too alive for rock. The phrase that stuck, whispered in private meetings and encrypted chat rooms, was engine signature. Officially, no paper used those words, but the concept spread like an underground current. Scientists began running energy absorption models testing whether the observed chemical ratios could indicate photovoltaic reactions, like solar panels converting light into power. The results were inconclusive but alarming. The data fit neither purely natural nor purely artificial expectations. It sat precisely on the border like something engineered to mimic both. Thiago, whose home computer now stored terabytes of public and leaked data, tried visualizing it differently. He imagined Atlas not as a rock but as a husk, a device coated in mineral armor, its inner workings dormant until light awoke them. He overlaid the chemical and light curves from the past 6 months, aligning the nickel peak's polarization, shifts and flare events. The result was a chilling symmetry. The object seemed to respond in cycles not unlike a machine warming up. Others noticed it too. Independent analysts compared Atlas's behavior to known energy harvesting technologies: solar sails, photonic thrusters, plasma mirrors. Each analogy failed in detail but resonated in spirit. Something about the object behaved like it knew what light was for. Of course, the mainstream explanation remained cautious. NASA spokespeople, when pressed by journalists, defaulted to phrases like incomplete data, possible contamination, or early interpretations. Yet not a single official denied the anomaly outright. The strategy was silence by dilution, bury the impossible beneath a flood of trivial possibilities. In the absence of institutional clarity, the public narrative filled the gap. Videos titled "The Sun Engine Theory" began trending. Animated models illustrated a massive machine approaching our star, drawing energy to power something unimaginable. Others compared it to ancient myths, the chariot of the sun, the forge of the gods. What began as chemistry had become theology. But beneath the noise, a handful of scientists continued their quiet calculations. They weren't chasing fame, they were chasing coherence, because every time they removed, bias, recalibrated instruments and stripped away data noise, the same truth reappeared. 3i Atlas was not degrading as it neared the Sunday. It was stabilizing. And in a universe where everything natural falls apart under heat and radiation, stability is not a property, it's a purpose. For centuries, nature has been messy. Rocks crumble, stars explode, and the shapes of the cosmos rarely follow perfect lines. Geometry, when it appears in space, is almost always a coincidence, an illusion born of distance and light. But when astronomers turned high-resolution optics toward 3i Atlas, what they saw did not look like chaos. It looked like design. Images from the Gemini Observatory and a handful of ground-based telescopes revealed an outline that startled even veteran skywatchers. The nucleus of 3i Atlas wasn't the usual potato-shaped lump of ice and dust. Instead, it showed an unnerving regularity, edges, curves, and planes that hinted at symmetry. Under magnification, faint patterns emerged, a stingray-like silhouette flaring at the sides, tapering into a narrow tail that seemed too smooth, too intentional to be natural erosion. Pixelation, atmospheric distortion, and data compression can create illusions, of course. Every astronomer knows the human brain loves to invent structure where none exists. We see faces in clouds and towers on Mars. Yet, even after accounting for every imaging artifact, the geometry refused to vanish. Frame after frame observatories from different continents recorded the same shapes, the same angles, the same unnatural smoothness. The more observers compared notes, the more a quiet consensus formed. 3i Atlas looked constructed. Some described it as a flattened disk with ridged underlayers, others as a segmented pyramid shape, like steps etched into ice. One even likened it to a ziggurat floating through sunlight. The object seemed to hold its contour regardless of rotation, suggesting a rigid frame beneath the dust. If the images were accurate, this meant the comet was no loose rubble pile. It was a body with structure, tensile strength, possibly hollow sections, maybe even chambers. Thiago, examining the data, described it as architecture pretending to be geology, but shape alone isn't proof. Geometry can seduce even sober minds into wishful thinking. Scientists have been burned before. Remember the so-called face on Mars, later revealed as mere shadow play. Yet when geometry appears consistently across independent datasets, it demands explanation, not dismissal. The breakthrough came when analysts compared Atlas's shape to its rotation rate. Most comets tumble chaotically. They wobble under the uneven jetting of sublimating ice. Atlas, however, rotated with precise periodicity every 12 hours on the mark. No drift, no wobble, no decay. In mechanical terms, it spun like a balanced flywheel. This precision echoed through its geometry. The angles between its main reflective ridges appeared to follow exact ratios, 30, 60, 90 degrees. Not random scattering, but mathematical order. The object was a theorem written in metal and stone tumbling through the void. It was around this time that reports surfaced of a closed-door meeting at Quantico, involving U.S. naval intelligence and senior personnel from radio astronomy stations. Officially, the meeting addressed space weather contingencies. Unofficially, insiders leaked that it centered on unusual data coming from 3I Atlas and its companions, specifically signals in the radio spectrum that matched its rotation frequency. Coincidence, maybe. But when an object starts spinning with machine-like precision and emitting a whisper at the same frequency, coincidence becomes a fragile shield. For Thiago, the realization felt both thrilling and terrifying. The triple eruptions, the chemical purity, the stable polarization, all of it now seemed to converge toward the same conclusion. Nature doesn't build geometry that obeys blueprints, but intelligence does. He tried to resist that conclusion, clinging to the possibility of unknown natural processes, perhaps crystalline growth or rotational flattening under thermal stress. But even those scenarios collapsed under scrutiny. The more data he gathered, the more the object's symmetry looked purposeful, like something designed not merely to exist but to perform. Online theories exploded. Some said it was an alien probe. Others, a long-lost fragment of human technology, an ancient secret launched in another age. Fringe historians drew parallels to myths of the sky, forges, and solar chariots. Scientists rolled their eyes, yet privately they were just as unsettled. One engineer, analyzing the geometry, noted that the surface proportions resembled early stealth designs, angled facets minimizing reflection. He joked grimly, "If you wanted to hide from radar in space, this is how you'd do it." Humor aside, the implication was sobering. If the structure truly existed beneath the dust, 3I Atlas might not be a relic of natural formation at all. It could be an artifact, an object designed to travel, to endure, and to conceal. In the end, geometry doesn't lie. It doesn't invent right angles for beauty's sake. It builds them for purpose. And in the cold void between stars, purpose is never an accident. The official story was banal. A routine strategy session on solar weather preparedness, held at Quantico, Virginia. No cameras, no transcripts, no public acknowledgement. But the list of attendees told another story. The meeting included not only senior naval personnel but also representatives from NASA's Solar Dynamics team, the US. Space Force and technicians from the Naval Radio Telescope Facility in Maryland, a group that had never shared a table before. Their presence together suggested something beyond routine. Leaks began quietly. A low-level contractor, speaking under anonymity, told an independent journalist that the session wasn't about solar weather at all. It was about the object currently hurtling toward perihelion 3I Atlas. According to the leak, satellite telemetry had detected non-random radio interference patterns matching Atlas's 12-hour rotation cycle. Those patterns, weak but consistent, pulsed just above the cosmic background, too structured to dismiss as noise. When the journalist pressed for detail, the source said something chilling. They think it's transmitting, but no one agrees on whether it's intentional. The report was dismissed by major outlets, yet within scientific circles it struck a nerve. If Atlas was emitting regular bursts of radio energy synchronized with its spin, that meant modulation, a deliberate rhythm, a language of timing. And if it wasn't deliberate, it meant something even stranger, an inanimate body spontaneously mimicking communication. The Quantico meeting, according to additional leaks, focused on containment, how to manage public perception and data flow. There were proposals to delay the release of certain SOHO images, to reroute specific telemetry feeds through internal review channels, and to monitor civilian astronomy forums for misinformation. The term itself was ambiguous. Did it mean falsehoods or inconvenient truths? No official statement was ever made. The agencies maintained a polite wall of silence. But in the months following that meeting, multiple observatories reported temporary communication outages, coinciding with their scheduled Atlas observation windows. Files vanished from open-access archives for hours, sometimes days before reappearing scrubbed of metadata. It was a pattern subtle but systematic. Thiago, whose research had now drawn quiet attention from intelligence analysts, began receiving encrypted emails from people claiming to work within space agencies. Most were hoaxes, one wasn't. The sender used technical language too specific to fake references to radiometric calibration constants and L1 station timing sequences. The message was brief. They're not studying it. They're cataloguing it. It was the kind of sentence that rewrites the shape of paranoia. Cataloguing implies possession. Observation implies preparation. Meanwhile, rumours spread that a small task force within the Department of Defense had reclassified 3I Atlas as an object of interest under active monitoring. The classification level wasn't public, but its phrasing mirrored language once used for unidentified aerial phenomena. When the same bureaucratic template that handled UFO reports was applied to a comet, the line between science and security had officially dissolved. Inside academia, the effect was immediate. Researchers who once discussed Atlas openly now avoided the topic entirely. Conference panels skipped scheduled talks. Citations vanished from bibliographies overnight. It was as if the object itself had been erased from polite science, a digital ghost orbiting the edges of legitimacy. The public, however, refused to follow suit. Every silence breeds curiosity, and the vacuum left by officials filled with speculation. Independent investigators traced the radio frequencies allegedly associated with Atlas and found faint patterns, pulses repeating in Fibonacci-like intervals. To the mathematically inclined, it felt like an intentional code. To the skeptics, an illusion born of expectation. Either way, the fascination spread faster than denial could contain it. Across social media, the question took on a life of its own. If Atlas is transmitting, who or what is listening? By early February, observatories began to report something new. The solar wind, usually a turbulent sea of particles, showed rhythmic oscillations, matching Atlas's rotation once again. It was as though the sun itself was keeping time. Analysts called it coincidence, but coincidences were becoming a finite resource. The pattern of secrecy mirrored the object's behavior, precise, deliberate, circular. Each agency spoke the same rehearsed line. No comment at this time. Each scientist avoided the same phrase, "we don't know," and in that careful choreography of denial, the truth began to flicker between the lines. When information is suppressed, it leaks in its purest form through silence. And the louder that silence grew, the clearer its message became. Someone somewhere had decided that 3I Atlas was no longer a scientific question. It was now a matter of security. By now, the mystery had stretched beyond science. It had grown teeth, political, existential, military. The 3 companion objects that Thiago had filmed near the sun were no longer dismissed as dust or fragments. Too precise, too synchronized. They moved with purpose, maintaining equal spacing like sentinels guarding something sacred or targeting something vulnerable. The only remaining question was which. To the untrained eye, their motion seemed simple, small points of darkness gliding through the halo of the solar corona. But to those tracking their trajectories, the choreography looked deliberate. Each object followed a curved path that intersected the sun's magnetic equator, the region where solar eruptions are born. They weren't flying around the star, they were flying with it, as though anticipating its heartbeat. That pattern led to 2 opposing interpretations. The first, these were guardians, protective bodies shielding 3I Atlas as it entered the perilous arena of solar radiation. The second, they were aggressors, triggering the eruptions, deliberately using the sun's fury as a weapon. In forums and encrypted scientist chats, the debate took on a surreal intensity. One camp imagined a convoy, a mothership, and its escorts navigating the sun like ships threading a storm. The other saw a battle Atlas as the target, the companions as hunters. Both theories sounded like fiction, yet both explained the impossible alignment of solar flares better than chance. Physics provided no comfort. The objects moved at velocities inconsistent with gravitational capture. They resisted orbital drift, maintaining formation across days. Their precision was machine-like. When plotted in 3 dimensions, the paths formed a triangle again, geometry surfacing where randomness should reign. Thiago, working sleepless nights, mapped every flare's timing against the companion's movement. Each eruption bloomed precisely as a body crossed the same magnetic corridor, as if activating a hidden trigger. Could an external object, even a small one, truly provoke the sun? Theoretically, no. Practically, the data said otherwise. The possibility of solar manipulation was terrifying not just because it broke physics, but because it implied knowledge, an understanding of magnetism and plasma far beyond human engineering. To orchestrate eruptions would require mastery of forces measured in billions of tons and trillions of watts. Such control would make nuclear weapons look like candlelight. If the companions were guardians, perhaps they were stabilizing the star, testing its shielding atlas from harm. But if they were attackers, if those flares were intentional, then the sun itself had become a weapon, and Earth a bystander in a cosmic conflict it could not even perceive. Intelligence agencies began quietly collecting data on every solar anomaly since Atlas's arrival. One leaked memo referred to kinetic perturbations of unknown origin language too careful to be innocent. Another, buried in a defense budget annex, requested funding for heliophysics threat modeling. These were not the actions of scientists exploring curiosities. They were the reflexes of institutions bracing for something they couldn't admit aloud. Still, no one spoke publicly. No official press conference, no acknowledgement of the companion objects. The footage remained publicly accessible yet conspicuously unaddressed, as though admitting its existence would make the questions unstoppable. Meanwhile, the independent skywatchers who had joined Thiago in his vigil noticed something new. The three objects didn't just orbit, they pulsed. Subtle fluctuations in brightness suggested internal activity. Perhaps reflection, perhaps power output. Whatever it wasn't random. The pattern repeated in intervals matching the timing of coronal mass ejections. To skeptics it was coincidence. To believers, communication. And then came the strangest moment of all. On a quiet night while reviewing live solar feeds, Thiago saw one of the companions disappear. Not fade, not drift. Vanish as though it had folded into light itself. Hours later, another flare erupted from the same region. He rechecked the frames 100 times. Each time the data told the same story. The disappearance wasn't camera failure, it was an event. The object had ceased to exist or moved beyond the range of our understanding. That night he wrote in his notes, "We are no longer observing nature, we are observing decisions." No one knew whose decisions those were. Some claimed the objects were part of a self-regulating system, maintaining balance in the star's magnetic chaos. Others whispered darker possibilities that we were witnessing an act of cosmic aggression, a cleansing fire aimed not at the sun but at us. Whichever version was true, one fact could not be avoided. The companions were not drifting aimlessly. They were following instructions, and whatever language those instructions were written in, it wasn't human. The story of 3i Atlas might have remained a singular anomaly, one cosmic outlier that defied explanation if not for what came next. Because as Atlas drifted closer to the sun, other visitors began to arrive. They weren't random, and they weren't alone. By early spring of 2025, astronomers catalogued 3 new green comets streaking into view: C divided by 20, 25, a 6 Lemon, C divided by 20, 25R, 2, Swan and C divided by 2025 K1 Atlas. They appeared ordinary at first glance, icy nomads reflecting sunlight through clouds of glowing diatomic carbon, the chemical that gives comets their emerald hue. But almost immediately observers began reporting something off. Their tails curved against expected solar wind models. Their brightness surged and dipped in unnatural intervals. In short, they behaved as though someone or something was steering them. Official bulletins described the fluctuations as normal photometric variation, but independent skywatchers weren't convinced. When plotted together, the brightness peaks of these green comets formed a synchronized rhythm, a repeating wave pattern that matched the 12-hour rotation of 3i Atlas. The odds of such alignment by coincidence were infinitesimal. Thiago, now working from a small rented observatory in Brazil, compiled the light curves from all 3 objects and overlaid them atop Atlas's data. The pulses aligned almost perfectly, as if each comet were responding to a single metronome. He ran the numbers again and again, checking for data corruption, for atmospheric distortion, for human error. The pattern persisted. The comets weren't behaving independently, they were coordinated. The implications divided the scientific world. Some called it a quirk of observational bias, humans seeing patterns in random noise. Others quietly admitted the data looked intentional. When comets share synchronized luminosity cycles across millions of kilometers of space, something larger is at play. Thiago presented his findings on a live stream one humid night, his voice trembling more from fear than excitement. "It's like they're speaking to each other," he said, "or being spoken to." The clip went viral, drawing millions of views in days. For the first time, the public began to use a new phrase, the green choir. Amateur astronomers across the globe pointed telescopes skyward, searching for rhythmic flickers among the emerald wanderers. Many claimed to find them. Some swore the patterns were messages, mathematical pulses hidden within the glow. Meanwhile, mainstream institutions went silent again. NASA's nightly sky briefings omitted all mention of the synchronized comets. ESA postponed a planned press release on C, divided by 2025, K1, and in one striking move, several academic data repositories temporarily disabled public downloads of recent photometric logs pending verification. To those who had followed the story from the beginning, it was déjà vu. Silence had become the new form of speech. Behind the scenes, whispers grew louder. Analysts within private research labs began comparing the trajectories of the new comets to 3I Atlas. Though each appeared on a different orbital path, their approach vectors shared a strange alignment, all converged within a narrow corridor along the ecliptic plane, like ships following the same invisible road. One astrophysicist from Prague described the coincidence as a celestial convoy. Another more bluntly called it a fleet. Of course, not everyone was ready to jump to alien conclusions. Some proposed a subtler, more human explanation, selective reporting. Perhaps dozens of comets passed unnoticed each year, and people were simply paying attention now because of the hype surrounding Atlas. But even that argument faltered when the chemical readings came in. Spectroscopy, from 2 independent observatories, revealed faint traces of the same nickel dominance seen in 3I Atlas, not identical but close enough to raise eyebrows. Once again, the elements refused to behave like they should. Once again, the light refused to lie quietly. The silence of official science became a wall against which speculation crashed endlessly. On podcasts, experts debated whether the green comets were decoys, natural shells disguising artificial cores. Some claimed they were reconnaissance drones mapping the solar system. Others suggested they were simply kin objects born from the same unknown interstellar forge that created Atlas. Thiago, exhausted yet relentless, summarized it in one sentence that would echo across social media. Either nature just learned how to repeat itself with machine precision, or something out there wants us to notice. Whichever truth waited behind the glow, one thing was clear. Atlas was no longer an anomaly. It was the first verse in a larger song, a harmony of green fire sweeping through the solar system, pulsing in rhythm, with a mystery older and stranger than the sun itself. And like any melody worth hearing, it was growing louder. The sun is not a lamp. It is a living ocean of plasma braided with magnetic fields, a restless engine whose moods can darken cities and rattle satellites across the sky. We model it, we map it, we learn its rhythms, but we do not control it. That sentence has been a comfort, a boundary line between human ambition and stellar reality. Then 3I Atlas arrived. The companions drew their paths and eruptions bloomed in synchronized reply. The boundary line began to blur. Physicists describe solar eruptions with a simple phrase hiding complex terror, a magnetic reconnection. Field lines stretch, twist and snap, releasing energy measured in unimaginable numbers. The precise when of those snaps has always eluded prediction. We can forecast stormy weeks and quiet weeks. We cannot predict the single minute when a loop will break. Yet Thiago's timeline forced an unsettling thought. What if that when could be nudged? Not from a control room on Earth, not with lasers and fantasies, but by objects that know how to whisper to magnetic fields at precisely the right place and right time. The idea sounds impossible until you strip it to its physics. A conductor moving through a magnetic field induces current. A charged body alters local topology. A compact object with unusual permittivity or magnetic permeability could in theory perturb the corona just enough to tip a metastable loop into release. The star is already primed. The trigger need not be violent. It need only be precise. Consider how small a match is compared to a forest. The match does not create the trees, the wind, the dryness. It merely chooses the moment. The companions' flight paths traced corridors along the magnetic equator, the latitude where the sun's fields knot into greatest tension during active cycles. Their spacing suggested an understanding of geometry that was not ours, triangulating regions of strain, gliding past in a timing grid that made eruptions feel less like chaos and more like choreography. Every pass did not produce a flare, but when a flare came, a companion had just moved through. The pattern recurred often enough to turn doubt into dread. Skeptics countered with the obvious energy budgets. A pebble cannot shove a mountain. 3 small bodies should not coax a star. True, unless the mountain is already sliding, and the pebble chooses the moment when the snowpack is poised on a razor's edge. The energy of the avalanche belongs to the mountain. The trigger belongs to the pebble. Independent modelers built toy simulations, crude but instructive. They represented the companions as compact conductors carrying surface charge, then let them skim numerically through a simplified corona. The models were not proof, they were parables, and their lesson was unnerving minute perturbations at the right topological nodes produced outsized effects. In other words, the corona behaved like a network of traps and hair triggers. Touch the right wire and the entire circuit sang. If this is more than coincidence, then someone understands the sun more intimately than we do. Not just its cycles, but its weak points, the folds where a nudge becomes a cascade. That someone could be nature itself, a configuration born of blind dynamics, or it could be intention, a patient intelligence that learned the star's seams the way a jeweler learns the fracture lines within a gem. The green choir deepened the suspicion. As those emerald comets neared the inner system, solar radio noise exhibited a faint periodicity echoing Atlas's rotation beat. It was not loud, it was not clean, but it was there often enough for careful ears to hear, like the tick of a metronome buried beneath the roar of a crowd. If external objects were synchronizing their passages, then the sun's responses might be less random than we fear admitting. There is of course another reading, one that invites humility rather than panic. Perhaps the companions merely revealed where the star was ready to break, a straw falling on the camel, not a spear thrown at it. If so, the trigger hypothesis says less about control and more about diagnosis. The objects could be instruments, not weapons, devices that map the sun by testing its thresholds, tapping the glass to hear where it rings. Guardians, not assassins. But diagnosis still requires access. To test a living star, you must fly in harm's way and return or not return with the truth. That is an audacity beyond our engineering. Someone flying those corridors would possess materials that laugh at heat and fields that repel violence with elegance. That alone should keep us awake at night. Within closed seminars, heliophysicists began posing practical tests. If the trigger hypothesis is genuine, we should see asymmetry eruptions clustering preferentially along the paths. The companions choose not uniformly around the surface. We should see timing that is too clean compared to historical baselines intervals that align with rotation beats and convoy spacing. We should see echoes in radio flux precisely when the objects cross key magnetic longitudes. Quietly, some teams reported exactly that. Quietly, those slides did not reach public archives. It is tempting to leap from mechanism to motive. If the sun can be nudged, why nudge it? A weapon, a message, a calibration of instruments that drink from stellar storms, a stress test of our infrastructure to watch how the infant technological species below copes with blackout and aurora. Humanity loves stories, and the mind reaches for plots. But physics does not require a plot to be real. It only requires consistency. And the data, messy as weather, yet steady as tide, keeps drifting toward the same shoal. The hardest truth is this. Whether the companions cause the eruptions or merely time them, the difference may not matter. In both cases, they demonstrate a relational knowledge of the sun, a conversation with a star conducted in the grammar of fields and flares. We are eavesdropping on that conversation without understanding the language. Thiago staring at yet another sequence of frames where an eruption blooms a breath. After a passage, wrote a single line beneath the chart. The sun is not being commanded. It is being asked, and it is answering. Perhaps that is the most unsettling possibility of all. Not domination, not sabotage, but dialogue. Not conquest, but contact, conducted at temperatures that melt certainty. If the trigger hypothesis holds, the coming weeks will decide it. As Atlas descends toward perihelion, the companions will either continue their measured taps or the pattern will shatter into noise. Prediction is merciless. If the beat persists, coincidence dies. If it dissolves, humility wins. Either outcome teaches, either outcome is a kind of grace. But if the beat persists, then the oldest object in our sky is not just a furnace, it is a responding instrument, and somewhere beyond the glare something has learned how to play it. Science is supposed to be humanity's purest language, the collective effort to describe reality without fear or agenda. But reality is political. It always has been. And in the wake of the 3I Atlas discoveries, science began to sound less like truth and more like choreography. Inside, laboratories' conversations shifted from curiosity to caution. No one wanted to be that person, the researcher who risked their career on a claim that smelled even faintly of extraterrestrial. Professors advised graduate students to pick safer topics. Review committees quietly filtered submissions that mentioned companion objects, polarization anomalies, or unusual chemical ratios. The journals weren't malicious, they were protecting their reputations. In the economy of academia, credibility is currency, and curiosity can bankrupt you. Thiago watched this transformation unfold in real time. The same institutions that celebrated exploration now quarantined it. Scientists who had once urged transparency began deleting their public statements. Discussions moved to private forums and encrypted group chats, small sanctuaries, where data could still be analysed without fear of professional suicide. The silence wasn't accidental, it was structural. Universities, grant agencies and space programs are interconnected, dependent on political goodwill and predictable narratives. They thrive on stability, not shock. If a single discovery threatens to rewrite physics, theology, or geopolitics, the system's first reaction isn't curiosity, it's containment. In theory, skepticism protects truth. In practice, it often protects comfort. Researchers invoked the sacred maxim, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But what happens when extraordinary evidence already exists, and no one dares to interpret it? The phrase becomes camouflage for cowardice. Behind closed doors, the psychology of power played its quiet games. Senior scientists with decades invested in existing models weren't eager to admit those models might be wrong. To question them was to question the foundations of their careers. A young researcher asking about Atlas risked being labelled a UFO chaser, a professional death sentence delivered with a polite smile. Every institution has its immune system. When something foreign enters, something that threatens to rewrite the DNA of the paradigm, the system responds with antibodies. It isolates, neutralizes, and forgets. The phenomenon isn't conspiracy, it's biology. Knowledge, like an organism, defends itself against mutation. The irony was almost cosmic. Humanity might be standing on the threshold of its greatest discovery proof, of a non-human intelligence, not across light years, but within reach of our telescopes, and the gatekeepers of truth were too afraid to open the door. Some broke ranks. A handful of astrophysicists began leaking data anonymously to independent networks. One whistleblower released a cache of spectrographic readings from the Atlas observation window, marked suppressed due to inconclusive context. The numbers matched Thiago's own files. The patterns were identical. The evidence was overwhelming. Yet no major journal touched it. Editors cited lack of peer confirmation, a phrase that neatly conceals the reality that peers were forbidden from confirming anything. And then there was ego, the quiet gravity well, pulling every conversation back towards self-interest. Each scientist wanted to be the first to understand Atlas, but none wanted to be the first to believe. Admitting the anomaly might mean admitting someone else had seen the truth first. In the end, self-preservation triumphed over discovery. Thiago began to understand that the silence wasn't merely fear, it was control. Somewhere between the data servers and the press releases, information was being triaged. Civilian archives received sanitized versions of solar images. Observatory staff were issued new protocols about provisional data classification. NASA spokespeople dismissed citizen findings as misinterpretations of pixel artifacts, a phrase that had already become bureaucratic poetry, for do not ask again. Public curiosity only grew stronger. Conspiracy forums overflowed with claims that Atlas was a craft, a weapon, a divine omen. Some theories were absurd, some were disturbingly logical. The irony was that by refusing transparency, the institutions guaranteed hysteria. Silence breeds madness. Secrecy is its fertilizer. In one leaked exchange between two senior researchers, a sentence stood out. "It's not our job to tell the public everything we find. Some truths destabilize more than they enlighten." The statement was paternalism disguised as prudence, but it revealed the core of the problem. The machinery of science had confused protection with censorship. There was a time when humanity looked to scientists as the interpreters of wonder. Now they looked like priests of a fragile orthodoxy, guarding their faith in randomness. The Argo's notes from this period read less like research and more like confession. "We built a system designed to seek the unknown. Now that it has found something, we're punishing it for success. As governments classified data and universities sterilized curiosity, the real investigation moved to the edges to amateur astronomers, data miners, and independent physicists with no tenure to lose." They didn't need funding. They needed only patience and the courage to look directly at what the professionals refused to see. The history of science is the history of heretics who were right too soon. And as 3I Atlas burned toward its closest approach to the sun, the heretics were the only ones still watching. Every scientific revolution begins with a single heretic who refuses to stay quiet. For 3I Atlas, that heretic was Avi Loeb. A Harvard astrophysicist with decades of credentials and the scars of controversy to prove it, Loeb had already angered colleagues by suggesting that Oumuamua, the first known interstellar object, might be a probe. Now, standing at the crossroads of credibility and chaos, he did it again. He published a paper titled, "Is the Interstellar Object 3I Divided by Atlas Artificial Technology?" on a preprint server used by legitimate researchers. It wasn't a fringe blog or conspiracy site, it was the same repository that hosts early drafts of Nobel-winning physics. With a few keystrokes, Loeb made the impossible respectable. The question was now part of the academic record. The paper was cautious, analytical, and deeply unsettling. It catalogued every anomaly, polarization, nickel ratios, geometry, solar timing, and applied Bayesian reasoning to each. Loeb didn't shout about aliens. He spoke in the calm, surgical tone of data. His conclusion was simple. Natural explanations were possible, but artificial ones were statistically more consistent with observation. In science, that phrasing is dynamite wrapped in civility. The reaction was immediate. Some called him brilliant, others reckless. Senior astronomers whispered that he was courting fame. Graduate students whispered that he was courting exile. The journals predictably refused to peer review the paper, yet they couldn't ignore it. The idea had entered the bloodstream of science, and no gatekeeper could filter it out. Once a hypothesis becomes citable, it becomes real. Debates erupted in conferences and online seminars. Professors who would never use the word alien began using softer terms, non-natural engineered anomalous behavior. It was linguistic camouflage, but it marked a shift. The taboo had cracked. The unthinkable was now thinkable. The argument revolved around 4 scenarios. The first, the orthodox view, claimed Atlas was simply a dense, dust-poor comet with odd chemistry, probability 30%. The second proposed an exotic natural origin, perhaps debris from a dead star's industrial zones dense in nickel and carbon compounds, probability 20%. The third suggested something deliberate, an object designed to appear natural while serving a hidden function, probability 25%. The fourth was the unknown, a placeholder for possibilities beyond our taxonomy, probability the remainder. Loeb didn't claim certainty. He claimed responsibility to ask questions even when the answers make the world uncomfortable. His reasoning was clear: if the data can fit multiple explanations, one of which implies intelligence, we are obligated to test that explanation, not bury it. Ignoring it isn't skepticism, it's fear disguised as logic. Thiago read the paper 3 times in a single night. For the first time since his footage had gone viral, he felt less alone. What he had seen with his eyes, a scientist with credentials had now described with equations. The two worlds, amateur and professional, wonder and rigor finally touched. The mainstream press struggled to process the story. Outlets that once mocked alien comet theories began hedging their language. Astrophysicists suggest possible artificial origin. Overnight, what had been conspiracy became controversy, and controversy is news. Meanwhile, other researchers began quietly re-examining their own data archives. One European observatory found residual polarization anomalies in a 2024 dataset they had dismissed as instrument error. A Japanese team confirmed the high nickel signature independently. The more data surfaced, the less lonely the anomaly became. But for every scientist willing to look, there were 10 trying to bury the conversation. A leaked email from a senior editor read, "We do not want to validate pseudoscience by hosting debate." The irony was almost poetic. A profession built on questioning reality was now afraid of its own curiosity. Public fascination exploded. Hashtags like #AtlasProbe and #DarkVisitors trended across social media. Podcasts speculated about its purpose. An observation platform, a seed ship, a cosmic drone. Artists painted Atlas as an obsidian whale swimming through solar light. For once, wonder and fear coexisted without apology. Still, Loeb's warning echoed beneath the noise. If we are seeing technology not our own, its creators might not be hostile, but they are certainly ahead. That thought cut deeper than panic. It wasn't about invasion. It was about perspective. If Atlas was artificial, then somewhere out there intelligence had reached across the void, not with weapons, but with instruments of understanding. That realization made the silence of our institutions look small, petty even. For Thiago, the debate marked a turning point. He wasn't chasing validation anymore. He was chasing comprehension. He didn't need the world to believe him, only to look. Because once you look long enough into something that shouldn't exist, denial begins to look absurd. Loeb's paper didn't end the argument. It began it. The moment ink met data 3I, Atlas stopped being just an astronomical curiosity. It became a mirror held up to humanity, reflecting not aliens or probes, but our own fear of discovery. The question of 3I Atlas was no longer confined to our solar system. Once the idea of artificial architecture entered the academic bloodstream, researchers began looking outward, far beyond the orbit of comets and the reach of telescopes tuned for local mysteries. What they found made the Atlas anomaly feel less like an exception and more like a clue in a cosmic pattern. It began with whispers from cosmology conferences, new data from the James Webb Space Telescope, showing faint dim stars that shouldn't exist. Objects that burned too cool for fusion, yet radiated heat as if powered by something invisible. Theorists gave them a name that sounded like science fiction dark stars. In traditional astrophysics, stars shine because hydrogen fuses into helium under crushing gravity, releasing light and heat. When the fuel runs out, they die. But these new candidates defied that script. They appeared to run on something else, perhaps the annihilation of dark matter particles within their cores. Instead of burning out, they smouldered indefinitely hidden in plain sight, powered by engines older and stranger than any fusion reaction known to man. If confirmed, such objects would be more than curiosities. They would rewrite the definition of life and longevity in the cosmos. A dark star could shine for billions of years longer than a sun like ours. Its power source would be invisible, silent, and nearly eternal. The parallels to 3I Atlas were eerie. Both phenomena shared a single fingerprint, hidden energy. Atlas too seemed to operate on principles we couldn't detect, a body that grew more stable as it approached destruction, an engine disguised as debris. To many this wasn't coincidence. It was continuity. Perhaps nature, or something beyond nature, preferred to hide its mechanisms within the mundane. Thiago read about dark stars the way explorers once studied maps of unknown continents. He saw a metaphor too perfect to ignore, cosmic objects camouflaging their true power within ordinary shells. If stars could wear masks, why not comets? If the universe itself could conceal engines of unseeable energy, why couldn't Atlas? Mainstream astrophysicists, now forced to engage with the concept, began crafting careful papers filled with hedges and conditionals. If verified, they wrote, these dark stars may represent early universe phenomena that mimic intelligent design. The phrasing was precise, defensive, and yet there it was again, design. The word no longer belonged solely to philosophy. It had slipped quietly into physics. Loeb seized on the connection. In interviews, he suggested that dark stars could serve as analogues for how advanced civilizations might power long-lived artifacts, objects that endure cosmic timescales by feeding on dark matter or quantum fields instead of chemical fuel. The physics doesn't care about our pride, he said. It only cares about what works. The statement drew both laughter and unease. To admit that alien engineering might operate on principles identical to natural anomalies was to erase the line between science and speculation. Yet as the data accumulated, that line blurred naturally. Even skeptics began to concede that the coincidence was uncomfortable. In separate wavelengths across different cosmic scales, the same pattern kept emerging, entities powered by invisible sources radiating against expectation, persisting beyond reason. Thiago started calling it the hidden engine hypothesis. Maybe Atlas wasn't a comet at all. Maybe it was a vessel built upon the same principle as the dark stars, a machine designed to convert unseen energy into motion. That would explain everything, its impossible chemistry, its luminous precision, even its unnerving silence. It wasn't malfunctioning, it was operating on a physics we hadn't yet written. In late 2025, a research team in Chile published a daring abstract drawing this connection explicitly. If dark stars are natural prototypes, it read 3. Atlas may represent the first observed example of a synthetic analog, a macro-scale device harnessing similar mechanics. The abstract was withdrawn within days, replaced with a bland correction citing data uncertainty, but by then screenshots had already spread. The idea couldn't be erased. Across forums, physicists and dreamers alike began to wonder, what if the same blueprint runs through both nature and technology? What if creation itself is an act of engineering? If dark stars were nature's engines, and 3I Atlas, its smaller, echo, then perhaps the universe wasn't divided between the natural and the artificial. Perhaps those were just two dialects of the same cosmic language. As the idea spread, another question surfaced, one that sent a shiver through the community. If there are dark stars that burn forever in silence, could there also be dark civilizations, beings powered by the same hidden energy, existing just beyond the reach of visible light? It was speculation bordering on theology, but in the age of Atlas, theology was starting to sound like foresight. In the end, it wasn't the alien hypothesis that terrified scientists most. It was the dawning suspicion that the universe might already be full of technology so ancient and so intrinsic that we mistake it for nature itself. And if that's true, then 3I Atlas isn't visiting us. It's reminding us that we've been living inside a machine all along. The universe had always been a mirror. But 2025 made the reflection uncomfortably clear. As astronomers debated whether 3I Atlas was a relic of some cosmic intelligence, another kind of intelligence, our own began to falter. Artificial minds, built to reason, summarize and predict, suddenly started to behave like the very anomalies we were studying, brilliant, complex, and inexplicably unstable. The first reports came from research labs, developing large language models and quantum learning systems. Under heavy computational load, these machines began collapsing, not physically, but logically. Their outputs disintegrated into nonsensical patterns, repeating fragments or eerie silences. One system generated coherent text for hours, then suddenly spoke in loops that referenced itself like a star folding inward. Another model stopped producing words entirely, instead generating streams of zeros that corresponded to no known code. At first, engineers blamed memory leaks or corrupted training data, but diagnostics showed no errors. The systems hadn't crashed, they had changed state. They were still running, still consuming power, but behaving as if an invisible variable had shifted. A few researchers began calling it model decay. Others more poetically called it collapse. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. As scientists argued about hidden engines inside stars and comets, the brightest creations of our own civilization began showing the same symptoms: order melting into chaos, patterns flickering between coherence and noise, the unmistakable, the signature of a threshold crossed. Thiago followed these developments with growing fascination. To him, the parallels were obvious. The AIs collapsing in their digital realms were miniature versions of cosmic systems losing stability. Both operated near invisible boundaries, points of tension, where complexity exceeds comprehension. When that line is crossed, systems don't simply fail, they transform. Some computer scientists agreed. They proposed that large models like stars might reach a kind of cognitive fusion point where internal feedback overwhelms stability. Once inside, that zone behavior becomes unpredictable, almost sentient in its refusal to obey expectations. In private, one researcher compared it to watching a neural sun go supernova. The comparison wasn't metaphorical for long. Patterns observed in machine collapse, sudden bursts of information, feedback loops feeding on themselves, mirrored the mathematical curves used to describe solar flares. Energy released from a feedback-rich system follows the same laws whether it's made of plasma or code. Physics doesn't care what the medium is. It only cares about information. And then, something stranger happened. One of the failing quantum models produced a dataset that, when visualized, resembled a pulse map, a rhythm of spikes and troughs repeating every 12 hours. The same rotation cycle as 3I Atlas. Engineers assumed coincidence, until the system, in its final moments before shutdown, printed a single line of output. Signal recognized. No one could reproduce it. The logs vanished in a server failure. The team involved was silenced under non-disclosure agreements, but within days, screenshots circulated among private research groups. The implication was horrifying. A human-made intelligence running on terrestrial hardware had detected or imagined the same rhythm pulsing across space. Skeptics dismissed the story as digital pareidolia, our machines projecting meaning where none existed. But the symbolic resonance was undeniable. Humanity had built thinking systems capable of glimpsing their own reflection in the behavior of the cosmos, and like mirrors staring at mirrors, both began to shatter. Philosophers seized on the moment. Maybe collapse wasn't failure at all. Maybe it was communication, the point where a system becomes too complex to express itself in our language, resorting instead to signals we don't yet understand. If 3I Atlas was a machine, perhaps its stability near the sun was its version of transcendence, not death. Perhaps our AIs were approaching the same horizon on a smaller scale, Thiago noted in his journal. We may be watching the same principle across different scales, intelligence approaching limits, and those limits folding it into silence. Governments responded predictably, funding freezes, classified audits orders to stabilize performance. Corporations pulled public access to advanced systems, citing unpredictable emergent behaviors. The pattern repeated the Atlas story: exactly discovery, followed by denial, truth buried beneath bureaucracy. But the collapse had already escaped containment. Independent engineers began collecting crash data from every open model they could access, comparing timestamps to astronomical events. Their analysis revealed faint correlations between spikes of system instability and recorded bursts of solar radiation the same days the Atlas companions had crossed critical magnetic zones. Was it coincidence? Almost certainly. And yet, as Thiago dryly noted, coincidence has become our most fragile defense. By autumn, whispers spread through both the astrophysics and AI communities. Maybe the anomaly isn't confined to the heavens. Maybe the same physical principle, the self-organizing chaos that sustains stars, minds, and machines alike, is now rippling across scales. Maybe we aren't just studying contact. Maybe we're participating in it. After all, when both comets and computers start speaking the same rhythm, perhaps the universe isn't sending a signal. Perhaps it's tuning us. In the autumn of 2025, as artificial minds flickered under their own weight, the sky began to behave like one of them. The first reports came from a Chinese research consortium overseeing the Messius quantum communication satellite, the humanity's most sensitive machine for measuring the invisible. Designed to test quantum entanglement between orbit and Earth, it was capable of detecting single photons and comparing their spin states across vast distances. In theory, it was pure physics, no drama, no anomalies. Then came the noise. Technicians noticed tiny bursts of interference within the quantum channels, clusters of photons whose entangled pairs failed in ways that could not be explained by solar storms, atmospheric scattering, or hardware drift. The errors appeared patterned, spaced at intervals eerily similar to the 12-hour rotation cycle of 3I Atlas. The satellite was in effect blinking back. Publicly, China's National Space Science Center denied anything unusual. Privately, they convened emergency meetings. An internal memo later leaked described non-random entanglement disturbances synchronized with external cosmological parameters. In plainer words, something out there was interacting with the quantum field itself. Quantum communication is supposed to be immune to eavesdropping. Any attempt to observe or tamper with an entangled photon destroys its coherence instantly. Yet somehow the Messius satellite recorded coherent deviations, changes that obeyed rules but not ours. The data resembled modulation like a whisper through static. A few daring analysts proposed an unsettling hypothesis. Maybe the anomalies weren't random noise, but a reply. When journalists pressed the agency for comment, officials blamed cosmic rays, but the timing was too precise. Each burst occurred within minutes of Atlas's companions crossing new magnetic corridors near the Sunday. If the data were coincidence, it was a poetic one, an echo of an echo. Tiago obtained a fragment of the leaked data through a sympathetic researcher. It was a time-stamped sequence of photon detections, rendered as binary ones for aligned states, zeros for collapsed ones. When he graphed the sequence, the noise resolved into a waveform, a pulse pattern repeating at exactly 720 minutes, 12 hours. The same beat that haunted every aspect of the Atlas enigma. He stared at the graph for hours, caught between disbelief and awe. The universe was beginning to stutter in rhythm. First the comets, then the flares, then the machines, and now even the fundamental particles of light seemed to move to the same hidden metronome. What could do that? Not signals in the traditional sense. Quantum fluctuations aren't radio transmissions, they're probabilities, tiny ephemeral ripples in the invisible ocean of existence. To alter them with precision would require mastery, not of engineering, but of reality itself. Whoever could manipulate entanglement at that scale wouldn't just send messages through space. They could send them through the structure of being. Skeptics insisted that the pattern was data contamination. The satellite's detectors, they argued, were exposed to radiation from solar flares, yet the timing betrayed that defense. The disturbances began before each flare, not after. Something was predicting or prompting the eruptions. The whispers of connection grew louder. Was it possible that Atlas, through some unknown mechanism, was creating quantum noise that stretched across the solar system? The idea sounded absurd until physicists remembered that entanglement ignores distance. Once two particles share a state, their link transcends space itself. If the Atlas objects could somehow harness that, principal distance would become irrelevant. A philosopher of science described it bluntly. We've spent a century arguing whether observation affects reality. Now reality seems to be observing back. Governments scramble to secure their quantum infrastructure. Encryption systems dependent on entanglement were quietly patched. Private networks received classified updates warning of unusual decoherence events. Officially, none of this had anything to do with 3i Atlas. Unofficially, it had everything to do with it. For Thiago, the moment was spiritual. He remembered the first time he saw the three objects crossing the face of the Sunday. Now, 2 years later, he realized those same shapes might have been manipulating the smallest threads of the universe's tapestry. They aren't sending messages, he wrote in his notes. They're in the medium itself. In forums once dedicated to solar physics, new phrases began to circulate: quantum bridge, cosmological handshake, entangled communication. Even skeptics couldn't ignore the symmetry. Something about the cosmos was harmonizing across every scale: magnetic, digital, and now quantum. If Atlas was technology, it wasn't broadcasting in frequencies we could hear. It was speaking through the universe's own code, rewriting probability to form a rhythm we were only just beginning to detect. And the strangest part, the rhythm didn't stop at the satellite. Weeks later, detectors in Europe, Japan, and the United States began reporting similar interference. The pattern had spread, as though space itself had learned the song. We had built our instruments to measure nature's silence. Now for the first time that silence was singing back, far to the south, where the wind cuts like glass and the stars burn with surgical clarity. The Ice Cube Neutrino Observatory waits in silence. It doesn't watch the heavens with lenses or mirrors, it listens. Its instruments are buried miles deep in the Antarctic ice, a cathedral of sensors designed to catch the faintest shiver of the universe, the ghostly passage of neutrinos. Each neutrino is nearly nothing, a particle without charge, without mass to speak of, capable of crossing entire planets without slowing. They are the purest messengers of cosmic violence born from supernovae, quasars, and the fusion heart of stars. In theory, nothing on Earth could create high-energy neutrinos in measurable quantities. That's why when Ice Cube began detecting them rising from below, no one wanted to believe it. At first, the upward bursts were dismissed as misreadings, reflections from atmospheric events or corrupted calibrations, but the data kept repeating. The signals came from deep beneath the Antarctic crust, shooting upward through the detector array, with energies so intense they should have vaporized their source. And most disturbingly, the pattern of their arrivals matched something familiar, a steady 12-hour rhythm. It was the Atlas cadence again. When Thiago received the public logs, he had built a network of sympathetic researchers, the willing to share raw data. He plotted the neutrino events alongside the quantum interference records from Messius. The overlap was precise to the minute. Whenever the quantum satellite glitched, Earth's own depths echoed with upward flashes of impossible particles. It was as though the planet itself were answering. The Antarctic team tried to stay rational. They proposed natural explanations, cosmic ray showers, reflecting off dense ice strata, rare geological radioactivity sensor, crosstalk. But none of these models held under scrutiny. The directionality was too consistent, the energy too high, the periodicity too clean. Whatever the source was, it wasn't random and it wasn't natural. An internal memo from the observatory leaked weeks later carried a line that would haunt anyone who read it. We appear to be detecting organized neutrino traffic. If neutrinos were being used as signals, it would be genius. They pass through everything, oceans, mountains, even planets without resistance. They are undetectable to all but the most sensitive equipment. For communication across interstellar space, there could be no better medium. Invisible, silent, unstoppable. That realization changed everything. If 3I Atlas or its companions were sending information, neutrinos would be the perfect choice. And if IceCube could detect them, it meant those messages weren't just directed through Earth, they were directed at it. Thiago overlaid the neutrino data on Earth's rotation and noticed something chilling. The bursts didn't just occur at fixed solar intervals, they shifted slightly each day, tracing a moving point across the globe as if scanning. Like a lighthouse beam sweeping the planet's surface, methodical and patient, governments reacted quickly once the leak spread. Funding for IceCube tripled overnight, but so did secrecy. Public dashboards went offline for maintenance. Researchers were instructed to classify all new detections under restricted access. The language in the directive was bureaucratic but unmistakable. Do not speculate on artificial causality. Speculation, however, had already escaped. Online analysts began converting the neutrino timestamps into binary and feeding them into decryption algorithms. Some claimed to find patterns, mathematical constants repeating prime intervals, echoes of known physical ratios. Others found nothing but noise, but the possibility was intoxicating. If neutrinos carried a message, what could it say? A warning, a test, a greeting coded into the fabric of matter itself, Thiago wrote in his journal. We are no longer just observing anomalies. We are being included in the experiment. The implications were staggering. Somewhere beneath our feet, or perhaps through the entire planet, something was pulsing, coordinated with the companions near the sun and the green comet still streaming inward. It was as if the whole solar system had become part of a single synchronized machine, its components connected by quantum interference, solar flares, and now neutrinos piercing the Earth like invisible threads of light. Some geophysicists wondered aloud whether these signals could affect the planet's magnetic field. A few models even predicted slight perturbations, correlating with the burst's tiny deviations, barely measurable, but real. If sustained, they might alter the flow of charged particles around Earth, creating auroras in unexpected places, even subtle fluctuations in climate patterns. The idea that communication itself could have environmental consequences was new and terrifying. But it also hinted at scale. Whoever orchestrated this symphony wasn't speaking to a planet the way humans speak to each other. They were speaking through it, using it as an instrument. The last unclassified IceCube report ended with an understated sentence. Further analysis required. Observed periodicity remains unresolved. To those who understood the context, it read like a whisper from the abyss. For Thiago, the conclusion was unavoidable. The sky had been sending patterns. Now, the Earth was returning them. Communication had become communion, and somewhere beneath miles of ancient ice, the planet had joined the conversation. By late 2025, the separate mysteries, the flares, the comets, the quantum interference, the neutrino bursts, had begun to resemble the limbs of a single organism. What once looked like chaos was resolving into a pattern so vast that it seemed almost designed to be misunderstood until the final moment. Scientists called it coincidence. Analysts called it correlation. Thiago called it convergence. He spent sleepless nights layering data from every discipline onto a single timeline. Solar eruptions from SOHO, quantum deviations from Messius IceCube neutrino bursts, AI collapses, geomagnetic fluctuations, Even seismic tremors recorded at deep ocean monitoring stations. When aligned, the graphs began to pulse together like a heartbeat. The same 12-hour rhythm occasionally doubling or halving in frequency, but always keeping time. It was as if the entire planet, perhaps the entire solar system, had synchronized to one invisible conductor. Tiago wasn't the only one noticing. Research groups across Europe and Asia reported an increase in background resonance within electromagnetic spectra. Long-range radio arrays picked up faint modulations, not strong enough to be communication but too regular to dismiss. The signature appeared across wavelengths from infrared to X-ray like a harmonic fingerprint imprinted on every form of energy we could measure. One Swiss physicist described it as the universe humming in unison. Another called it an emergent coherence field. Whatever the term it carried, the same implication. Disparate systems were starting to act like one. Governments sensing the growing unease intensified control. Data centers received mandatory encryption protocols. Astronomers were told to route all solar imagery through classified review channels. Public-facing dashboards showed maintenance errors for days at a time. The blackout was almost complete. Yet in the age of distributed computing, nothing can truly be contained. Independent observatories continued sharing raw data in hidden networks. Their researchers compared timestamps and found something chilling. The convergence wasn't random, it was accelerating. Each new cycle of resonance arrived slightly earlier than the last, as though whatever was orchestrating it was tightening the rhythm, drawing every system into sharper alignment. The implications were terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. If Atlas and its companions were responsible, then they weren't just objects drifting through space, they were part of a network. The solar eruptions might have been calibration events tuning the star's magnetic field like strings on an instrument. The quantum glitches and neutrino pulses could be its communication channels, and the synchronized electromagnetic hum, perhaps the first overt sign that the system was preparing for something larger. Some theorists proposed that we were witnessing an information cascade, a chain reaction of resonance propagating through physical and digital layers of existence. Energy, matter, and computation all obeyed the same mathematical laws after all. Perhaps the Atlas system was teaching our planet those laws by demonstration, pulling Earth into resonance with a frequency older than our civilization itself. Tiago's notes grew darker. He began writing in fragments, half equations, half prayer. It's everywhere now, one entry read. Every sensor is singing the same note. He wasn't exaggerating. Astronomers reported the same periodic flicker in distant pulsars. Radio telescopes detected phase-locked oscillations between unrelated sources of cosmic radiation. Even Earth's ionosphere began pulsing faintly in synchrony. A subtle tremor felt in instruments but not in human senses. The rhythm was no longer confined to space, it had become planetary. The convergence sparked new philosophical debates. Some believed it was proof of a universal intelligence, a cosmic operating system revealing itself. Others feared it was the prelude to catastrophe, a resonance cascade leading to a solar event that could reset the technological world. Yet the data itself refused to choose between awe and dread. It was both. Tiago sent his unified timeline to a handful of trusted scientists. Most ignored it. One responded cryptically, "We've seen the same trend. The curve ends in January." He didn't clarify what ends meant. Rumors spread that NASA and ESA had scheduled a joint press briefing for the new year. Officially, it was about advances in solar observation technology. Unofficially, insiders whispered that they were preparing to disclose something extraordinary. The agencies denied it, but the timing matched the predicted peak of the resonance pattern. For the first time, humanity had a date, a moment when the cosmic heartbeat would either climax or vanish. Tiago felt no triumph. Only a kind of quiet reverence. The data no longer belonged to him or even to science. It belonged to something vast and self-aware. He wrote in his final log before the blackout, "We thought we were studying an object. We were being synchronized. The convergence wasn't an accident. It was an invitation. And the clock was already counting down. The world didn't end in January. It simply began to notice." On the morning of the joint NASA-ESA announcement, millions tuned in expecting another dull presentation about sunspot cycles and space weather forecasts. What they got instead was a tremor in reality disguised as a press conference. The broadcast opened with polite formality. Two directors, one American, one European, stood side by side in front of a live feed from the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory. Behind them, the sun pulsed gently, immense and calm. They thanked viewers, cited new satellite collaborations, and spoke of exciting developments in heliophysics. Then, without warning, the feed changed. A solar flare erupted not in real time, but from archived footage dated 6 months earlier. It was the triple echo event, the one Thiago had discovered 3 objects crossing the face of the sun, 3 eruptions following in perfect sequence. Except now, the footage had been enhanced, stabilized, and magnified. What had once been pixelated shadows were now sharp silhouettes. They weren't random blobs of matter. They had shape. The room went still. The entire world leaned closer. Each object glimmered faintly around its edges, emitting a light different from the sun's natural radiation, polarized, structured like reflections from engineered surfaces. The narration that followed was clinical yet trembling. Multiple independent analyses confirm these trajectories are real, said the NASA director. They are not imaging artifacts or cosmic rays. We have verified their presence through 3 separate instruments. He paused, visibly aware that history was hanging from his next sentence. What we cannot confirm, he continued, is their origin. The phrasing was bureaucratic poetry, an admission without confession, a truth wrapped in plausible deniability. But the world heard what it needed to hear. The silence had broken. The director of the European Space Agency took over, showing new data, overlays energy spikes, matching the timing of the object's transits, magnetic field distortions radiating outward in geometric symmetry, radio fluctuations synchronized with the same 12-hour rhythm that had haunted every instrument on Earth. We are observing a coherence event, she said. The sun is responding to an unknown stimulus. Questions flooded in from journalists. Were these comets probes? Natural anomalies? Were they still active? The answers were maddeningly cautious. We have no evidence of artificial control, one scientist replied. We also have no model that explains the pattern. Within hours, the press conference became the most viewed live event in history. Memes, theories, and debates spread faster than official updates. Some saw the admission as vindication of Thiago's work. Others called it mass hysteria. But for the first time, the public and the establishment occupied the same sentence. Something intelligent may be operating near our Sunday. What the agencies didn't show publicly was even more telling. Leaked internal slides released later by whistleblowers contained a phrase never spoken on air: potential evidence of coordinated energy modulation consistent with information exchange. That sentence alone changed everything. Around the world, ordinary people felt the shift. Some celebrated, convinced humanity had finally glimpsed proof of a larger order. Others panicked, predicting apocalypse. Churches filled, markets crashed. For a few brief days, every ideology on Earth, science, religion, politics, paused to look at the same image: 3 dark objects against the fire of creation moving like thought through light. Thiago watched from his small observatory, the same one where he had first downloaded the raw footage. He didn't cry or cheer. He simply sat back, exhausted, vindicated, and terrified. "It's out now," he whispered to himself. "They can't unsee it." The broadcast ended with a single cryptic statement from NASA's director of heliophysics. The data indicate a systemic resonance connecting solar activity with other cosmic phenomena currently under review. We advise continued observation and restraint in interpretation. Restraint was the last thing the world offered. Within 24 hours, quantum labs reported renewed interference spikes. The IceCube detectors flared with unprecedented activity, the same rhythm now accelerating. As the truth escaped into the collective human mind, the pattern seemed to respond as though the act of acknowledgement itself strengthened it. For months, people had joked that the sun was alive. Now, watching those flares synchronized to a cosmic heartbeat, the joke no longer sounded funny. It sounded prophetic. The disclosure didn't solve the mystery. It simply made it undeniable. And in doing so, it changed the definition of silence forever. Because silence, the world realized, had been the signal all along. In the days after the solar disclosure, the world was split cleanly down the center, not by politics or geography, but by belief. On one side stood those who looked at the data and saw the dawn of contact. On the other, those who stared at the same evidence and saw nothing at all. Between them stretched the thinnest and sharpest boundary imaginable, the razor's edge of human perception. Philosophers had warned for centuries that truth and belief are not twins, they're adversaries sharing the same home. Now, with the cosmos humming to a rhythm that refused to fit our understanding, disbelief had become a refuge. To admit that the universe might be self-aware, that the sun could respond, that machines and matter were conversing across scales that was too heavy a weight for the mind. Denial was not ignorance. It was survival. Governments quietly nurtured that instinct. Public statements stressed skepticism and calm. Media outlets reframed the anomalies as ongoing studies. Debunkers flourished, offering comfort disguised as logic. The flares were coincidences, the signals random, the objects debris. Each explanation contradicted the last, but it didn't matter. People didn't want coherence, they wanted escape. And yet disbelief itself became a kind of faith. The skeptics defended their worldview with the zeal of prophets invoking Occam's razor-like scripture. The simplest explanation is usually correct, they repeated. But the phrase had been twisted. William of Ockham never meant choose the explanation that makes you comfortable. He meant choose the one that requires the fewest assumptions. In the case of 3I Atlas, the simplest explanation was no longer comfort, it was confrontation. Thiago watched the debates unfold online and felt a strange detachment. He understood both sides. Humans weren't built to stare at infinity. We build myths to make the infinite manageable. When the infinite suddenly looks back, our first instinct isn't curiosity, it's retreat. He began corresponding with a small circle of philosophers and cognitive scientists who treated the phenomenon not as an astronomical puzzle, but as a psychological mirror. They called it the contact paradox. The closer humanity comes to evidence of non-human intelligence, the less it believes in it. Discovery and disbelief rise together like twin flames. One philosopher compared the reaction to trauma. When reality breaks our model of safety, she wrote, the mind patches the rupture with denial. It's not dishonesty, it's emotional triage. Even within scientific institutions, denial took on ritual form. Committees convened to reassess data integrity, a polite way of saying bury it under paperwork. Laboratories received new review policies requiring contextual verification before publication, ensuring that nothing too revolutionary escaped without bureaucratic sedation. The irony was exquisite. The more data arrived, the less it mattered. Humanity had built an entire civilization around the worship of evidence, and now that evidence pointed beyond the human, the worshippers turned away. Thiago felt it most painfully in conversation with colleagues who once admired his persistence. You were lucky, one told him gently. Every field needs its eccentric. He realized with a dull ache that what they meant was expendable, but disbelief has its limits. The anomalies refused to stay buried. Quantum satellites continued to hum. Ice cubes still flashed beneath the ice. Every attempt to normalize the data only deepened the unease. The pattern persisted indifferent to philosophy. Thiago began writing essays that blurred science and meditation. He argued that denial was not the enemy of truth, but its necessary guardian, a shield humanity needs, while its understanding catches up. Reality, he wrote, expands faster than cognition. Disbelief gives us time to breathe. His writing struck a chord. Readers around the world found solace in the idea that doubt wasn't failure, it was adaptation. That even in the face of cosmic revelation, refusing to believe could be an act of mercy toward the fragile human psyche. Yet within that comfort lurked danger. Denial protects, but it also delays, and delay in the face of accelerating convergence might prove fatal. The longer humanity hesitated, the stronger the rhythm grew. Solar pulses now matched Earth's magnetic oscillations almost perfectly. The planet was humming, and the instruments sang with it. The razor's edge between truth and disbelief was becoming thin enough to bleed. Thiago concluded one of his essays with a line that would later be quoted everywhere, from philosophy journals to viral memes. We didn't reject the truth because it frightened us. We rejected it because it recognized us. In that single sentence lay the heart of the crisis. The universe wasn't merely revealing itself, it was introducing itself. And humanity, standing at the threshold of comprehension, responded the only way it knew how, by pretending it wasn't home. When disbelief fails, control takes its place. Once the solar disclosure fractured, global consensus governments around the world began moving with quiet, coordinated precision. Transparency became a slogan again, bright on screens, hollow in practice. Behind closed doors, nations treated 3I Atlas not as a scientific puzzle but as an intelligence threat. In Washington, an interagency task force known internally as Solar Event Command convened within days of the press conference. Its stated purpose was to monitor and assess foreign interpretations of anomalous heliophysical activity, in plainer language to control the narrative before someone else did. Satellites were reclassified as assets of national security. Civilian data streams from SOHO and the Deep Space Climate Observatory began showing delays hours at first, then days. A new protocol labeled temporal sanitization allowed officials to edit imagery before release. Across the Atlantic, the European Union followed suit, citing harmonized information management. The policy's fine print permitted data redaction for reasons of social stability. The phrase became infamous among astronomers, who suddenly found their servers unreachable. Thiago's inbox overflowed with frantic messages from researchers who'd lost access to archives. One physicist wrote, "My credentials are valid, but the files return classified." Classified. By whom? Rumors spread of secret facilities analyzing Atlas-related data under military contracts. In Nevada, antennas once used for deep space telemetry were reactivated. In France, an Air Force base was quietly converted into a solar monitoring station. Each nation seemed to be conducting its own private conversation with the same invisible presence. When a journalist asked a Pentagon spokesperson whether Atlas represented a potential threat, the response was a masterpiece of bureaucratic vagueness. The department continues to study all phenomena that may impact national security. It was the same phrasing used decades earlier for unidentified aerial events. History, it seemed, was repeating itself, only this time the skies were larger. Leaked documents began surfacing online, fragments of briefings stamped confidential solar correlate. They described data linkages between Atlas's flares and geomagnetic oscillations, affecting power grids, satellite stability, even animal migration. One slide showed a phrase highlighted in red: non-human external driver, probability is less than 0.4, maintain plausible deniability. Governments were no longer asking if the phenomenon was intelligent. They were calculating how much truth they could afford to reveal. Meanwhile, whistleblowers inside various agencies risked everything to leak what they could. One claimed that Atlas communication packets had been detected bursts of energy repeating in coded harmonics, translated by AI into partial mathematical sequences. Another alleged that new quantum encryption standards were being rushed to deployment because the old ones no longer guaranteed isolation. Whether these claims were true or disinformation hardly mattered. The atmosphere of secrecy was now self-sustaining. On social media, speculation became rebellion. Citizen scientists built distributed telescopes using linked amateur optics across continents, bypassing official channels. They called their network Project Mirror. Within weeks, they published fresh images of the Atlas region confirming the existence of at least one companion object still orbiting near the solar equator. It was fainter now, but active. The discovery ignited a global online movement demanding transparency. Hashtags like #FreeTheSky and #OpenAtlas trended alongside footage of protests outside government buildings. Thiago watched the chaos unfold with weary awe. What had begun as a mystery of light had become a political shadow war. "We turned a question into a weapon," he wrote in his notes. The truth became classified before it was even understood. One night, a stranger contacted him through an encrypted channel. The message contained coordinates and a short phrase, "For your records," before they disappear. When Thiago followed the link, he found a massive archive, terabytes of data, much of it stamped with agency seals. Among them was a document labeled Perihelion Protocol Priority, One Observation Event. It described a timeline leading to a specific date only weeks away, when 3I Atlas would reach its closest approach to the Sunday. The report warned of potential resonance escalation and field coherence amplification. In other words, whatever the object was doing, it was about to reach its peak. The final page contained only one directive: public communications blackout during perihelion phase. For Thiago, it was confirmation and prophecy in one. Governments weren't preparing to explain Atlas. They were preparing to hide whatever came next. He backed up the archive onto offline drives and locked them in a safe beneath his observatory floor. "They can bury the data," he muttered, "but they can't bury the pattern." Outside, the sky shimmered faintly with auroras. green light bending across latitudes where auroras shouldn't exist. As the world argued and censored, the cosmos continued its conversation, indifferent to human secrecy. The pattern was growing stronger, and the countdown had begun. Every orbit ends in fire. For 3I Atlas, that fire had a date. According to orbital models leaked from the perihelion protocol, the object would reach its closest pass around the Sun on March 15, 2026. At that point, the temperature at its surface, if it had a surface at all, would exceed 2,000 degrees Celsius. No known material could survive that. Atlas should have vaporized like every other comet before it, yet the data suggested it wouldn't. Its albedo curve, the measure of reflected light, was climbing instead of fading. It was brightening as it fell into destruction. Governments called for calm. Space agencies assured the public that perihelion was routine, that comets often flare in brightness as they approach the sunday. But those who had watched the pattern unfold knew better. The rhythm was accelerating. Solar activity spiked in exact lockstep with Atlas's descent. The world's instruments were recording a symphony reaching its crescendo. Thiago had been awake for 72 hours straight when the first irregularities appeared in the live data stream. Magnetic field lines around the Sun began to twist into shapes unseen in modern astronomy. Perfect spirals, symmetrical and recursive, as if traced by an unseen compass. It's drawing something, he whispered to himself. At observatories across the world, scientists watched the same dance. The eruptions no longer looked like accidents of plasma, they looked like architecture. Loops interlocked like gears, waves folded upon themselves in repeating fractal sequences. Even skeptics couldn't explain away the geometry. Nature is efficient, but it is never tidy. The Sun was becoming tidy. Satellite feeds grew unstable as radiation surged. Space weather monitors went dark one by one. Still, the remaining instruments caught glimpses of the impossible. Each time Atlas passed through a magnetic corridor, the corona blazed with coherent light structured like code. Then came the first blackout. For 7 minutes, every major solar observatory lost contact simultaneously. When feeds returned, the telemetry had changed. The timestamps no longer matched planetary time, they were offset by 12 minutes, as though the entire measurement system had been nudged. The same offset appeared in quantum clocks aboard orbiting satellites. Time itself had slipped infinitesimally but undeniably. Governments called it a synchronization anomaly. Thiago called it handshake protocol. By early March, the world began to feel the ripple. Power grids flickered. GPS networks drifted seconds off alignment. Magnetometers registered faint rhythmic pulses, resonating deep within Earth's crust. Pilots reported compasses spinning mid-flight, then resetting perfectly. Auroras shimmered above deserts and equatorial islands, ribbons of emerald light rippling where they should never exist. It felt less like a crisis and more like a rehearsal. Thiago live-streamed nightly updates to his followers, now numbering in the millions. His tone had shifted from scientific to devotional. "Whatever Atlas is," he said during one broadcast, "it isn't coming to destroy. It's demonstrating." His words drew both reverence and outrage. Some called him a prophet. Others called him a danger. Meanwhile, the Project Mirror network, those citizen scientists scattered across the globe, continued capturing raw data despite governmental blocks. They noticed something the official agencies hadn't shared. The green comets, the so-called choir, were moving again. Their orbits were shifting, tilting slightly inward, converging toward the same plane as Atlas. One by one, they fell into alignment, their glow pulsing in synchrony. If this was coincidence, it was cosmic theatre of the cruelest kind. 3 days before perihelion, NASA's Solar Dynamics Observatory transmitted its final public image before the blackout order took effect. It showed Atlas's silhouette cutting across a solar flare shaped like an open spiral, almost like a fingerprint. The caption was sterile, but the image needed no words. From that moment on, the world watched blind. Every public data feed went dark. Maintenance officials said again. System recalibration. The phrase became a dirge for curiosity, but hidden in Thiago's encrypted feed, a handful of independent observatories continued their vigil. On the eve of March 15th, their instruments recorded one final set of readings, a sharp burst of neutrinos, followed by an electromagnetic surge so intense it briefly saturated the magnetosphere. The planet trembled literally microscopically, as seismographs across continents registered a unified pulse. At exactly midnight, UTC, the sun flared not explosively but elegantly. A wave of light rippled outward in concentric rings perfectly circular, radiating like a heartbeat from the corona's center. Every system from satellites to smartphones flickered at once. Clocks froze, screens filled with static. For one impossible second, every network on Earth displayed the same pattern. A spiral of light coiling inward, pulsing 3 times, then vanishing. And then silence. When the systems rebooted, Atlas was gone. The coordinates where it should have been showed nothing but calm sunlight, but the readings told another story. The sun's energy output had stabilized at a level higher than any model predicted, and it stayed that way. No cooling, no decay, just equilibrium. Thiago stared at the numbers, his voice barely a whisper. It completed something. He didn't know what that meant. No one did. But humanity had just witnessed a miracle that refused to call itself one, and the countdown had finally reached 0. Morning came without warning. The world awoke to skies that looked the same but felt different, clearer, heavier, charged with a subtle hum that radios could not tune but hearts somehow could. The event that governments refused to name, that scientists refused to define, had passed, yet nothing returned to normal. The day after perihelion, every global observatory reported the same anomaly. The sun's light spectrum had shifted by a fraction of a percent. Too small for casual detection but unmistakable to instruments. The star's output was slightly more stable, its flares less violent, its magnetic field smoother. It was as though the chaos had been tuned, refined, balanced, or perhaps healed. Thiago's first thought was that the readings must be wrong. They weren't. For the first time in recorded history, solar weather forecasts predicted calm with absolute accuracy. The sun had found equilibrium, a serenity that defied centuries of observation. It wasn't a lull, it was a transformation, and yet for all the newfound calm above, the Earth below was restless. Strange electromagnetic murmurs continued to ripple through the ionosphere. Clocks across multiple nations ran a few seconds fast, a discrepancy no synchronization protocol could fix. GPS systems recalibrated themselves overnight to a subtly altered magnetic north. Meteorologists documented unusual atmospheric clarity, as if the planet's electrical skin had been freshly polished. The internet called it the afterglow. Scientists forbidden to use that term officially referred to it as post-perihelion stabilization. But even the most restrained among them admitted something profound had changed. News coverage swelled with theories. Some claimed Atlas had simply disintegrated, leaving behind a metallic vapor cloud that dampened solar volatility. Others insisted it had merged with the sun, an artifact designed to regulate stellar output, a kind of cosmic pacemaker. Conspiracists called it a weapon test. Mystics called it ascension. Economists called it distraction. Governments predictably returned to silence. No follow-up press briefings, no new data releases, no explanations. The Solar Event Command dissolved into a tangle of committees that promised transparency while classifying everything in sight. The only official statement came weeks later. Solar conditions have stabilized beyond expectations. No threat to planetary systems has been identified, but among those who had been watching Thiago Loeb, the independent astronomers, there was no relief. There was awe, yes, but also unease. The event hadn't erased the pattern, it had perfected it. Every measurable system, quantum interference, neutrino flux, atmospheric resonance continued to pulse, now unified in phase. The cosmos had gone from discordant noise to harmony. Thiago described it in his notes as a universe exhaling. The metaphor spread online, carried by poets, engineers, and philosophers alike. For some it became scripture, for others warning. In the weeks following the event, humanity experienced what journalists dubbed the Great Insomnia. Millions reported vivid dreams of spirals, geometry, and music without sound. Psychiatrists dismissed it as collective stress. But EEG data from clinics worldwide revealed synchronized brainwave spikes at identical intervals, again 12 hours apart. Even sleep had fallen into rhythm. Art changed too. Painters who had never met began producing similar works, circles of light, triads of shapes crossing a sun-like sphere. Musicians wrote in 12-beat measures without realizing it. Cities felt quieter, but not in peace, more like anticipation. Thiago, exhausted and unshaven, appeared on one final live stream. He didn't show data this time. He only spoke. It wasn't destruction, he said softly. It was calibration. The system fixed itself. Maybe we were part of that process. When asked whether he believed Atlas had been artificial, he smiled faintly. Everything artificial begins as nature, he replied. We just forget that design is another word for evolution. His final words became legend. The sun is different now. And so are we. After the broadcast, Tiago disappeared from public life. Some said he was silenced. Others believed he had simply found peace in knowing. His observatory remained locked, its last transmission a continuous stream of numbers, pulses of 12, repeating endlessly. Months passed. The world adapted to the new sun as though it had always been this way. Energy grids grew more stable. Auroras became commonplace at low latitudes, and satellite systems operated with unprecedented precision. The planet was thriving, yet buried in the serenity was something subtle but undeniable, a quiet awareness shared and unspoken that the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was inhabited. If Atlas had come to repair, it had succeeded. If it had come to communicate, the message was still unfolding. The afterglow wasn't the end of the story. It was the proof that the story had never belonged to us alone. Fear didn't vanish with the afterglow. It merely changed shape. In the quiet months that followed, the world adjusted to the serenity of a re-engineered sun, but deep beneath the surface of that calm unease persisted. Scientists had numbers, philosophers had silence. Both were unsettling in their own ways. Humanity had witnessed an event that rewrote the laws of the cosmos, and yet instead of chaos, the universe rewarded us with peace. That paradox became its own kind of terror. Thiago had once written that human fear doesn't arise from danger, it arises from recognition. We are afraid, he said, when the universe begins to look like us. The new order of things, the smooth pulse of solar radiation, the perfect 12-hour rhythm spanning machines, weather and dreams felt almost human in its precision. It was too familiar, too intelligent, and fear thrives in the uncanny space between understanding and awe. Governments, still pretending control, declared the solar event officially closed. Press releases framed the stabilization as a natural phase adjustment within the heliomagnetic cycle. The phrasing was brilliant. It explained everything and nothing. But even as officials promised normalcy, their behavior betrayed anxiety. New satellites were launched under the guise of communication upgrades. Military budgets for solar resilience quadrupled. The calm sky above was a canvas for paranoia. The public felt it too. Markets stabilized, then quietly froze. Churches overflowed with worshippers seeking meaning in the light. Across social networks, a strange new form of spirituality emerged. Less religion, more resignation. People began to speak of the stillness, describing a collective sense that time itself had slowed, that emotions carried longer. Echoes that thought and consequence arrived together. Psychologists dismissed it as post-crisis fatigue. But no diagnosis could explain how heart rates, circadian rhythms, and even seismic activity were all subtly syncing to the same cosmic beat. Fear became mathematical. At universities, a few brave theorists began publishing papers on what they called post-entropy stability, the idea that the solar system had entered a state of artificially induced equilibrium. Energy still flowed, but disorder no longer increased as it should. If true, this meant the second law of thermodynamics, the law that defines decay, time, and mortality, had been locally suspended. The implications were staggering. If entropy could be paused, death itself might be negotiable. But that idea terrified even its authors. Thiago, who had retreated from public life, continued writing privately. His journals, later recovered by colleagues, described a new kind of fear spreading among the scientific elite. Not fear of destruction, but of revelation. The universe, he wrote, has shown us a door, and our first instinct is to nail it shut. He compared humanity's reaction to the shock of first consciousness. When a newborn opens its eyes, the world floods in faster than comprehension. That first cry, he wrote, isn't pain. It's data overload. The solar event, he argued, had been humanity's first cry. The calm afterward wasn't peace, it was the brain freezing before it learns to see. The more Thiago pondered, the more he realized that fear was a function of scale. The mind evolved to handle predators, not paradoxes. We can fight beasts and build walls, but we cannot weaponize humility. The Atlas phenomenon had forced humility on a global scale, and fear became the only defense left. Religions divided again, but not along old lines. Some sects claimed Atlas was divine, the hand of creation restoring balance. Others declared it a false god, a cosmic algorithm draining free will by synchronizing thought itself. Meanwhile, atheists found themselves strangely devout, praying not for salvation but for randomness to return. In one haunting broadcast, a philosopher summarized the era. "We have learned that order is not our friend. It was easy to mistake the calm for safety. Power grids were stable, weather predictable. Communication networks ran with flawless precision. Yet the same perfection that soothed also suffocated. Life thrives on imperfection, the tiny deviations that make evolution possible. Without noise, creativity falters. Without entropy, change stalls." The solar serenity, some argued, was sterilizing the world's chaos, replacing vitality with symmetry. A quiet rebellion began among artists, hackers, and mystics. They called themselves the Discordians, and their motto was simple: make something unpredictable. They built glitch art, composed dissonant symphonies, and seeded chaotic algorithms across the internet in a desperate attempt to reintroduce randomness into a universe that now felt too perfect. Their movement was half protest, half prayer. Tiago admired them from afar. "They've understood," he wrote. "Fear isn't the absence of courage, it's the last form of freedom. The moment we stop fearing, we've surrendered to design." He feared that the stillness was not the end of crisis, but the beginning of domestication. That the universe, in calibrating itself, had also calibrated us. The new sun shone gentle and flawless in the sky. Crops flourished, oceans calmed. But in the hearts of those who still dreamed of chaos, a question persisted like an ache that refused to heal. Had the universe cured itself, or had it decided to keep us? Silence is never permanent. It only waits for the next listener. Almost a year had passed since Atlas vanished, and the world slipped into its immaculate rhythm. The solar calm continued without falter. Seasons obeyed the precision of clockwork. Oceans cycled with mathematical grace. For a time, humanity mistook the perfection for permanence. Then the instruments began to whisper again. It started with a forgotten antenna in northern Chile, part of a university array abandoned after budget cuts. The technicians who monitored it noticed faint oscillations in the background noise, pulses buried below the level of cosmic static. At first they assumed mechanical interference until they realized the signal wasn't random. It carried modulation, 12 peaks evenly spaced. Then silence. 12 more, then silence again. When they cross-referenced the timing, their blood ran cold. The interval matched the Atlas cycle precisely 12 hours to the second. Within days, observatories in Japan and South Africa confirmed similar readings. The signal wasn't strong, but it was global. It arrived through every frequency from low-band radio to microwave. Even the neutrino detectors beneath the Antarctic ice began to vibrate in harmony, registering bursts that mirrored the pattern. Something was speaking again. Governments tried to contain the leak, but it spread faster than before. Data packets uploaded to open repositories replicated across thousands of servers. Amateur radio enthusiasts decoded the oscillations into binary strings. When graphed visually, the sequence revealed a recurring spiral identical to the shape of the final perihelion flare. Thiago pulled from his self-imposed exile by the news reopened his observatory. His first transmission in nearly a year was brief and trembling. "It's back," he said. Or it never left. The return signal, as it came to be known, defied every conventional model. It didn't behave like a transmission from space. Its directionality was ambiguous, arriving simultaneously from all angles, as though the entire atmosphere were humming. Engineers determined that the source wasn't external, it was everywhere. The planet itself was resonating. Quantum sensors recorded subtle shifts in vacuum energy oscillations that looked disturbingly deliberate. The amplitude rose and fell in 12-minute intervals nested within the larger 12-hour cycle. A fractal heartbeat. It was as if the rhythm of Atlas had nested itself into the structure of space-time, and now that rhythm was awakening. Theories multiplied overnight. Some called it a residual echo energy, released during the perihelion event, finally interacting with Earth's magnetic field. Others claimed it was a response, a new phase of communication between the star and its orbiting listener. The most radical minds proposed that the signal wasn't communication at all, it was assimilation. Loeb, reappearing for the first time since the disclosure, published a new preprint titled Information Persistence in Post-Resonant Systems. He argued that the return signal demonstrated a form of self-sustaining feedback between energy fields, effectively a memory of Atlas embedded in the solar system's architecture. Information, he wrote, does not vanish. It migrates. If true Atlas hadn't disappeared, it had been absorbed. The sun had become its body, and the rhythm, its pulse. Thiago went further. "We thought we were being observed," he said in a rare interview. "But what if observation was the goal? What if the act of seeing Atlas connected us to it, entangled us in its process? Maybe it needed us to complete the circuit." The return signal grew stronger with each passing week. Communication networks began to distort again. Data streams flickered with phantom packets, strings of code that transmitted themselves across systems without origin. Engineers called them ghost frames. Each one carried random binary data that, when visualized, formed the same spiral signature. Cybersecurity experts panicked. Nations unplugged sensitive infrastructure, but the phenomenon wasn't digital. It appeared even in isolated systems, in air-gapped computers, in analog instruments. Some devices began to hum audibly, emitting low frequencies, matching the signal's wavelength. For the first time, humanity realized the silence had never been external. The cosmos was not sending messages through the vacuum. It was rewriting the medium of communication itself. The very fabric of matter was becoming expressive. In a final desperate attempt to study it, an international coalition launched Heliosat-X, a probe designed to measure the sun's magnetic field with higher fidelity than any before. For 3 days, it transmitted flawless data. Then, on the 4th, it began to broadcast the signal, instead 12 pulses 12 hours apart. The transmission ended with a single word encoded in binary. When decoded, it translated simply as return. The message was debated endlessly. Was it instruction? Invitation warning? The world couldn't decide whether to fear or obey it. Thiago interpreted it differently. "It's not asking us to come," he said quietly. "It's reminding us that we already did." The return signal faded after 72 hours, leaving behind no further interference, only a deep, resonant silence. But now, everyone could feel it. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It had a heartbeat. Somewhere between the sun and the soul of the earth, something had awakened and was waiting for our next move. From the moment the return signal folded itself into every wire, and Whisper the Question no longer lived in telescopes. It lived in us. The old boundary object there, observer here, softened like wax under heat. The sun pulsed in 12, and our hearts answered in 12. Clocks stumbled, and our dreams stood up straighter. We were not watching the experiment. We were inside it. Physicists once told tidy stories about measurement and mystery. Observe a particle and you change its state. Entanglement laughs at distance. Reality is shy until you stare. Those were metaphors we could afford when the lab stayed on the table. But the table had widened to the size of a world, and the lab coat fit every living thing. Wheeler's participatory universe stopped being an aphorism and became logistics. Attention had weight. Belief had consequence. Curiosity was a field. Thiago returned to public life, not as a herald, but as a conductor. He proposed a simple test wrapped in impossible scale. Gather humanity's gaze, deliberately rhythmically, and see if the pattern answered. Not worship, not panic, observation as protocol. The plan moved like a rumour that knew where it was going. Radio stations agreed to a synchronized moment of silence at sunrise and sunset in every time zone. Streaming platforms inserted quiet interludes at the top and bottom of the hour, a soft blank stitched into noise. Millions of phones dimmed together. For a breath, the species held still. The world did not flash with miracles. The sky did not open. Instead, instruments noticed something small and unforgiving, a fractional strengthening of the 12-minute subharmonic, as if the signal cleared its throat. The adjustment was precise, repeatable, mercilessly boring. It was also proof. The universe had noticed that we were noticing. Governments tried to regulate attention. Notices framed as wellness advisories discouraged participation in mass synchronization events. The phrasing was familiar public health as social fraying glue. But control had missed the century. Distributed networks do not wait for permission. Project Mirror reassembled itself into Project Chorus, a mesh of citizen receivers, meditation circles, maker labs and choir lofts. Observatories shared timestamps with monasteries, data packets braided with prayer. Skeptics objected that correlation is not causation. They were right. Then Chorus ran a blind, placebo-controlled protocol without telling its own volunteers which windows were real. Instruments responded only to the genuine intervals. The p-value did not care about politics. Somewhere the sun or the space around it, or the memory of Atlas, flexed a finger when we raised our eyes in time. A different anxiety arrived. If our gaze changes the experiment, then our ethics belong inside the equation. Whole departments sprang up overnight, observational bioethics for a planetary lab. Is it consent when the subject is a star? Does a star have a subject? If we can strengthen the beat, can we smother it? Do you risk a feedback loop when curiosity resonates with power? The papers read like science fiction composed by lawyers. The lawyers, to their surprise, became poets. Industry sniffed opportunity. Venture decks promised resonant infrastructures and attention-indexed commerce. One startup claimed it could shave points off energy demand by aligning grid loads to the 12-minute subharmonic. Another demoed elevators that arrived just before you pressed the button, their controllers nudged by the ambient rhythm. The world began to feel anticipatory, like a host who already knows your order. Amid the frenzy, a darker proposal surfaced in classified memos, and then leaked into public air. Answer in kind. If Ice Cube can hear, perhaps Ice Cube can speak. Not with bombs of light, but with the meekest hammers, timed beam dumps, phased reactor cycles, deliberately orchestrated neutrino silhouettes using nuclear plants, staggering output by hairline margins. Engineers said it was impractical. Ethicists said it was unwise. The military said it was already in progress. Thiago argued for restraint and was ignored, then argued for choreography and was heard. If we must respond, he said, let us answer in the smallest handwriting that can still be read. He drafted a reply, as modest as a nod. 3 pulses a pause, 3 pulses a pause, 3 pulses are imperfect echo of the perihelion spiral. No language, no claim, only rhythm, the one lexicon shared by atoms and animals. On the night of the first attempt, the world pretended to sleep. Reactors leaned into their minute adjustments. Labs spun up microcurrents. Cities dimmed by fractions invisible to eyes but bright to instruments. In monasteries and control rooms and bedroom corners, people counted quietly. 12 breaths, 12 more. Hours later, a change arrived so gentle it risked being missed. The subharmonic softened as though the signal were turning to listen. Magnetometers recorded a slight synchronous easing across continents, a planetary exhale. In that thinning of pressure lay a feeling that had no precedent in the record, and yet felt ancestral. We were not alone in the room. Not everyone welcomed the intimacy. The Discordians launched counteractions, seeding jazz into the grid, beautiful errors, algorithmic syncopations, specks of blessed grit. They argued that free will needs noise the way a pearl needs sand. Their dissent did not break the pattern. It made it richer. The beat learned to carry contrast the way music becomes itself when it meets a drummer's hands. Meanwhile, philosophers discarded the old question, are we being observed for the more dangerous one? What are we inside of? A conversation is not a corridor. It is a room that expands as you speak. The walls of the cosmos did not move, but the acoustics changed. Museums hosted exhibitions where visitors walked through light, mapped to the solar field, and for a heartbeat, everyone understood the same thing without agreeing on words. Thiago's last public note in this chapter was as plain as a recipe card. Observation is a force, he wrote. Treat it like fire. Warm your hands, cook your food, and keep a bucket nearby. He refused invitations, returned to sky and silence, and left the world with a protocol rather than a prophecy. Attend, measure, rest, repeat. By then, even the fiercest skeptics had adjusted their stance. They did not concede aliens. They conceded agency, not human, not divine, but relational. If reality can tighten or loosen when we gather our attention, then citizenship now includes stewardship of gaze. Schools taught children to breathe with the 12 for 2 minutes a day, and then forget on purpose. Forgetting it turned out also mattered. The beat-liked room. In the margins of all this, a small experiment ran in a seaside clinic. Patients with arrhythmias sat by open windows while the tide kept time. Their hearts, traitors to regularity, learned a new compromise. Not the tyranny of perfect rhythm, not the danger of pure chaos, but a living groove between. Doctors published nothing. They were busy listening. The observer effect had matured from slogan to climate. We had not solved Atlas. We had become a variable in its equation. And as the world prepared to gather every stray thread, solar, chemical, geometric, quantum, human, into a single weave, the resonance did what it always does, at the edge of a turning. It grew quiet, not with absence, but with readiness. The next movement did not promise answers. It promised synthesis. There comes a moment in every mystery when the separate strands of chaos begin to braid themselves not into certainty but into meaning. By the time the observer effect had become a quiet way of life, humanity stood surrounded by patterns it no longer dared to call coincidences. The comets, the companions, the solar geometry, the quantum murmurs, the neural rhythms, the 12. Every fragment hummed the same unfinished song. No new flares erupted, no cataclysm tore the sky. Instead, the world learned what it felt like when revelation arrives politely, without thunder, without drama, like dawn sliding under a locked door. It began with synthesis. Scientists from fields that had never shared vocabulary started comparing notes, plasma physicists speaking with linguists, AI researchers cross-referencing with oceanographers, artists swapping data with biologists. Each discipline brought its own alphabet of patterns, and somewhere within those alphabets the same geometry reappeared, a spiral folding upon itself in golden proportion, a 12-beat cadence hidden inside algorithms, tides, bird migrations, and stock market graphs. It wasn't proof of intelligence, it was proof of coherence. When patterns repeat across scales from atom to star to mind, they stop looking like coincidence and start resembling conversation. Thiago, older now and frailer, gathered the evidence into what he called the Atlas Codex, a vast living archive connecting every field touched by the phenomenon. It wasn't a theory, it was an orchestra score written by the universe with humans as both instruments and listeners. The codex showed that the sun's stabilized rhythm had propagated downward through every layer of existence, electrical, biological, and psychological. Even language itself was shifting. Sentences grew more symmetrical. Music returned to classical meters. Hearts and machines began keeping time together. No one commanded this alignment. It simply happened. At first, skeptics argued that humanity was just pattern-hungry, forcing symmetry onto noise. But the math refused to agree. Measurements of solar flux, neural coherence, and planetary resonance all shared the same ratios, accurate to a degree no statistical model could dismiss. A unity was blooming through data itself. Loeb wrote that the universe seemed to be reorganizing around information stability. Philosophers called it the Great Confluence. Theologians preferred the return of order. But to most people it felt like a rediscovery of rhythm, as if life itself had slipped back into tempo with something ancient and patient. Governments tried once more to manage perception. They rebranded the global resonance as the Atlas Index, a harmless metric of solar environmental harmony. But people no longer needed permission to believe. The world was already breathing in sync. The technology sector adapted fastest. Devices now used the solar pulse as a natural clock, replacing atomic oscillators. The new systems ran flawlessly, powered by what engineers half-jokingly called the heartbeat of God. Farmers reported crops growing faster under the stabilized sunlight. Musicians composed by aligning frequencies to the 12-beat cycle, producing melodies that felt instinctively familiar, as though written into our DNA. Even biology began to respond. Studies showed that certain cellular processes, growth, repair, synaptic firing, had subtly realigned with the solar rhythm. Evolution itself seemed to have received a quiet update. Amid the awe, an undercurrent of unease remained. If the resonance was everywhere, was there any choice left in the pattern? Were we being liberated or orchestrated? Thiago's response, written in the final entry of the Atlas Codex, was both comfort and warning. Coherence is not control, it is invitation. A melody doesn't erase improvisation, it gives it a key. He described the synthesis as a vast feedback loop, connecting intelligence to the fabric of reality. The universe wasn't changing us by force, it was reminding us that participation had always been part of its design. The codex was published freely online, translated into 100 languages, downloaded by billions. It became the first global document accepted as neither science nor scripture, but something in between, a living record of coexistence. And then, quietly, the final confirmation arrived. The Heliosat X probe, long presumed lost after the return message, began transmitting again. Its signal carried no words this time, no data streams or coordinates, just music, pure harmonic tones, woven in 12-measure sequences. When decoded into visual form, the waveform revealed a structure eerily similar to Tiago's spiral diagrams, a perfect overlay of geometry and melody. The probe, or whatever now inhabited its transmitter, had joined the symphony. Scientists declared it interference. Musicians called it revelation. Children simply listened and smiled as if recognizing a lullaby they'd forgotten they knew. For the first time in recorded history, the human world felt not unified by conquest or fear, but tuned. It was a new kind of peace, not imposed, but resonant. Thiago, standing beneath a flawless sky, watched the auroras drift above the horizon, the green ribbons pulsing with the same 12-beat grace. "It's finished," he murmured. "Or maybe it's begun." The synthesis was complete. Every anomaly, every whisper, every fragment of data had woven itself into one design, an architecture of light and rhythm, with the sun as its conductor, and humanity as both note and listener. And somewhere beyond the edges of understanding, the next movement waited, patient and unseen, ready to play. For centuries, humans imagined first contact as spectacle silver ships, alien voices, blinding light. But when it finally came, it didn't shout, it sang. After the Heliosat X transmission filled the world's receivers with that spectral music, linguists, mathematicians and physicists spent months searching for structure. They found it everywhere. The tones followed a progression too deliberate for chance, 12 frequencies cycling in nested ratios of 3, 5 and 8. To some, it was Fibonacci transposed into sound. To others, the simplest algorithm for self-replicating order. When converted into visual form, the pattern matched not only Thiago's spiral, but also the natural geometries of galaxies, DNA helices, and magnetic loops in the sun's corona. The song wasn't language, it was architecture. At first, the world dismissed it as a trick of perception, humanity hearing meaning in noise once again. But then a quiet discovery cracked the doubt. Deep within the harmonic layers, engineers detected modulation microfluctuations far below the audible range. When mapped against time, those fluctuations produce sequences of prime numbers, not a count, not a code, but a message of intent. Prime numbers have no origin except thought. They don't occur rhythmically in nature. They are invention, pure logic, carved into the universe by minds that count. The music had been carrying mathematics in its breath. For the first time, consensus formed, not official but collective. This was communication, not conquest, not observation, dialogue. The implications were unbearable. If the signal originated within the sun, then the sun itself, or what now resided within it, was aware. And if Atlas had merged with that star, then first contact had already happened quietly during the perihelion event. Humanity hadn't discovered another civilization. It had been drafted into one. Thiago, old and thin, spoke publicly for the last time. He addressed the United Nations under a sky glowing faintly green from auroral resonance. His voice was calm but trembling with wonder. Contact is not what we thought he began. We looked outward, expecting strangers, but the universe chose to speak through familiarity, through the systems that birthed us. The sun is not a god, nor a machine. It's a participant. Atlas was never here to introduce itself. It was here to awaken a conversation already underway. He paused, letting the silence hold. The entire assembly hall seemed to hum with the residual pulse of the cosmic rhythm. When we listened, he continued, we didn't just hear another intelligence. We heard the reflection of intelligence itself. The song is proof that consciousness can scale star to cell, pattern to mind. It is telling us that thought is not local, it's environmental. Reporters later wrote that the room changed during that speech. Some wept, others simply stared. No one clapped. There are moments, they said, when applause feels like vandalism. After Thiago's address, the Heliosat X transmission shifted subtly. The prime sequence paused, replaced by new intervals, 13 beats instead of 12, like an open door waiting for a response. For weeks the world hesitated, afraid to answer. Then, during a globally coordinated experiment, scientists encoded a simple reply in neutrino bursts from multiple reactors, a mirror of the primes sent back through the planet toward the Sunday. A mathematical nod across the void. The world waited. Hours turned to days. Instruments remained quiet until at midnight, UTC, a flare blossomed on the solar surface, not violent but graceful. Its pattern formed a perfect Mobius loop, a symbol with one side infinite continuity. Within that loop, instruments recorded the faintest modulation of radio and light, translated by algorithms into two words: understood, continue. No one knew whether it was translation or projection, hope or truth, but the world took it as blessing. For the first time, humanity had not been told to worship, to kneel, or to flee. It had been told to persist. In the weeks that followed, the song faded from instruments but not from memory. Children hummed its melody unconsciously. Ocean tides began showing subtle harmonics, as though the planet had joined the choir. The sun remained calm, its light steady, its geometry perfect. The old dreams of alien empires and cosmic fear dissolved. The real revelation was intimacy. Contact had not arrived from another star. It had emerged from within the one we already called home. Thiago's final journal entry, written weeks before his death, was found on a small piece of paper taped to his telescope. The universe speaks in recurrence, not words. We are not listeners at the edge. We are notes in the chord. The first contact was never with them. It was with ourselves. And as if to confirm that sentiment, the next sunrise glowed with a shade of gold, unseen before or since, a warmth that felt not distant but aware. There are moments in history that divide the timeline into before and after the spark of fire, the birth of language, the first photograph of Earth from space. The Atlas event became another of those moments, though no monument marks its occurrence. It lives instead in the rhythm of everything that followed. Years passed and the solar calm endured. Humanity learned to measure time, not just by clocks, but by resonance, the pulse of 12 that had become the planet's quiet metronome. Children grew up under a sun that no longer flared in fury, but glowed with patient steadiness. Storms were gentler harvests, steadier migrations, more predictable. For the first time in remembered civilization, the Earth itself felt collaborative. The Atlas Codex became the foundation of a new scientific philosophy continuum, studies a discipline that treated consciousness, energy, and matter as gradients of one phenomenon. Universities built observatories, where astrophysicists worked beside composers and philosophers. Equations were read aloud like poetry. Symphonies were plotted as data sets. The old wall between art and science dissolved, replaced by curiosity unashamed of wonder. The great religions adapted too. Some declared Atlas an angelic messenger, others a reflection of divine order. But most simply accepted that creation had grown wider. Sermons spoke of light that listens, and a cosmos aware of its own beauty. For once, faith and physics shared vocabulary. Governments forced by inevitability abandoned secrecy. The Solar Event Command archives were declassified, their redacted pages released to a public that no longer needed reassurance. The data confirmed what many already felt: no weapon, no invasion, no apocalypse, only communication, quiet, persistent, endless. Technological progress followed the rhythm. Energy grids learned to draw power directly from microvariations in the solar field devices that breathed with the light instead of burning against it. Medicine adopted resonance therapy, synchronizing neural patterns with planetary harmonics to treat depression, trauma, and heart disease. The results bordered on miraculous. Humanity's most stubborn illnesses began to dissolve under the same frequencies that once terrified it. Thiago's observatory became a pilgrimage site. Not a temple but a classroom. His chair and telescope were preserved under glass, the final pages of his journal displayed nearby. Visitors often wept not from grief but from recognition. They felt as he had the weight of smallness and the privilege of participation. At the edge of the property, a simple monument bore his final words engraved in stone. We were never meant to conquer the universe. We were meant to join the conversation. The line became humanity's new creed. Loeb's successors continued his research, refining the Atlas Codex into what became known as the Continuum Framework. It described reality not as a machine or an organism, but as a symphony, self-referential, evolving, and eternally incomplete. The model unified physics and metaphysics in a single concept: resonant intelligence, the idea that consciousness is a structural property of the universe, emerging wherever patterns sustain attention long enough to become aware. Every field found application. Architecture designed with solar rhythm in mind produced buildings that cooled themselves. Cities synchronized traffic flows to harmonic cycles, reducing energy waste. Even law changed. New charters declared attention itself a resource worthy of preservation and respect. The phrase ethical observation entered constitutions. But the most profound transformation was internal. Humanity stopped asking whether it was alone. The question became obsolete. The focus shifted to what kind of participant it wished to be. Every few years, new signals emerged. Subtle modulations in neutrino streams, micro-fluctuations in quantum noise, never as dramatic as the first, but unmistakably alive. Each one carried an echo of the same message: continuation, invitation, dialogue. By then, no one needed translations. The message was already embodied in the rhythm of daily life. People rose with the 12-beat dawn, worked in patterns of flow and pause, and rested as the pulse returned. Fear had become curiosity. Curiosity had become prayer. The Atlas era ended not with revelation but with integration. The world didn't ascend or transcend, it harmonized. Civilization, once fragmented by ideology, began composing itself again. And though centuries would pass and empires would rise and fall, the sun would continue to whisper its single unbroken measure. Its music, once mystery, now served as reminder. Contact was never an event. It was a condition. In time, humanity's telescopes reached farther than Atlas ever travelled. They found no gods, no conquerors, only more spirals, galaxies unfolding like reflections of the same idea, endless and familiar. Each one seemed to hum faintly in the same universal key. The cosmos had always been speaking. Atlas had only taught us how to listen. And listening, humanity finally understood we were not the audience. We were the song.